Hey guys, let's settle in for a different kind of story tonight. A journey into a different corner of true crime history. Tonight, we're exploring the mysteries that unfold not in the desolate wilderness, but in the heart of our bustling, modern world. These are stories about people who vanished in plain sight, swallowed by the anonymity of the crowd. They are tales that question the nature of community in an age of digital connection, and probe the chilling reality that in a city of millions, a person can become a ghost long before they die. We'll be walking through the quiet, unseen spaces of our society, examining the lives of those who slipped through the cracks, leaving behind only the faint echo of a question. How can someone so present, so vibrant, simply cease to be? Before you get comfortable, perhaps take a moment to glance out your window at the world outside. Notice the countless lights, each one a home, each one holding a life, a story, a universe of private joys and secret sorrows. Think about the profound, sometimes frightening, anonymity that separates us, even when we are only feet apart. It's a comfort to know that we can bridge that distance here. A quiet community gathering from all corners of the globe to share in these stories. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. And on that note, if you truly appreciate what we do here, the quiet, respectful space we try to create, a like and a subscribe is the very best way to show it. It helps us continue this journey together. Now, dim the lights. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. The unexplained death of Joyce Vincent in January of 2006. In the Wood Green district of North London, a group of officials arrived at a housing block called Pelham House to perform a grim but routine task. They were there to repossess a small, one-bedroom flat on the third floor. The tenant, a woman named Joyce Carol Vincent, was more than 2 years behind on her rent, and the housing association that owned the property had finally obtained a court order to take it back. The building itself was a typical piece of urban architecture, a place of transient lives and shared walls, situated above a busy shopping center. It was a place where the constant hum of the city provided a backdrop of anonymity, where neighbors might exchange a passing nod but rarely a conversation. The bailiff stood outside the door to Flat D. There was no answer to their knocking. This was not unusual. Often, by this stage, the tenant had long since abandoned the property. Following procedure, they began to force the door open. As the lock gave way, they were met with a wall of darkness and a foul, pervasive odor that was far worse than the usual smell of a neglected flat. It was the scent of decay, heavy and oppressive. The only light came from the flickering blue-white glow of a television set, which was inexplicably still on, its silent images dancing in the gloom. As their eyes adjusted, the scene inside came into horrifying focus. The flat was in a state of quiet disarray. Mail had piled up behind the door, a mountain of unopened letters and circulars dating back years. In the main room, a small Christmas tree stood in the corner, and beside it, a neat pile of brightly wrapped presents lay waiting, covered in a thick layer of dust. And there, on the sofa, silhouetted against the glow of the television, was the reason for the smell. It was a human skeleton. The remains were almost entirely decomposed, dressed in a nightgown and lying on its back. The television, tuned to the BBC One channel, was still on. So was the central heating. The police were called, and a strange, deeply unsettling investigation began. This wasn't a search for a killer, but a desperate attempt to answer a much more fundamental and disturbing question. How could a human being lie dead and undiscovered in a busy London housing block for nearly 3 years? The skeleton was quickly identified through dental records as the flat's tenant, 38-year-old Joyce Carol Vincent. The coroner's report determined that she had likely died sometime around December of 2003. An exact cause of death was impossible to determine due to the advanced state of decomposition. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of a struggle. An autopsy could not rule out either natural causes, like a severe asthma attack from which she suffered, or foul play. Her death was officially recorded with an open verdict, a declaration that the mystery of how she died could not be solved. But this only deepened the profound mystery of how she had lived, and how she had been forgotten. The mechanics of her long invisibility were a chilling puzzle of modern, automated life. For a significant period, Her rent had been partially covered by housing benefits, which were paid directly to the housing association. When those payments stopped, the arrears began to accumulate, but the process of legal repossession is slow and bureaucratic. Her other bills, for electricity, for gas, were on autopay, with small amounts being debited from her bank account month after month, keeping the lights on, the heat humming, and the television flickering long after she was gone. The smell of her decomposition had been noticed by some neighbors, but it was attributed to the large waste bin situated just below her flat. The constant noise from her television was likewise dismissed as the normal background sound of a neighbor who simply liked to keep it on. No one had reported her missing because, as investigators would soon learn, there was no one left in her life who expected to hear from her. The Joyce Vincent who began to emerge from the initial investigation was a woman of shocking contradictions. She was not the recluse or the lonely hermit that one might imagine. The early picture painted by the few acquaintances the police could find was of a vibrant, beautiful, and ambitious woman. She was born in London in 1965 to parents of Caribbean heritage. She was described as intelligent and driven. She had worked in the finance industry in the heart of London, in respectable, high-pressure jobs for companies like Ernst & Young. She was, by all accounts, a somebody, a woman who had a career, friends, and a life. How does a person like that simply fall off the face of the earth? Investigators began the painstaking process of trying to reconstruct her final years, a task that proved incredibly difficult. They discovered she had quit her finance job in 2001 for unknown reasons. After that, her life seemed to enter a more transient phase. She had spent time working as a cleaner in a budget hotel and had lived for a period in a shelter for victims of domestic abuse. This last detail was a significant and dark clue. It suggested a hidden life, a world of trauma and fear that she had kept separate from her professional persona. Had she been running from someone? Friends from her earlier life recalled that in her last interactions with them, she had seemed to be in some kind of trouble, hinting at a controlling or dangerous boyfriend. The Christmas presents found in her flat became a heartbreaking symbol of her isolation. They were addressed to people in her life, yet they had sat there unopened for 3 Christmases. The act of wrapping them suggested a desire to connect, a plan to reach out that was never realized. It was a snapshot of a woman on the verge of bridging the distance she had created, a final, failed attempt to break through her own solitude. As part 1 closes, we are left with a haunting portrait of a modern ghost. Joyce Vincent was not lost in an uncharted wilderness, but in the most densely populated city in the Western world. Her story is not just about a death, but about a life that became invisible. The central question is not what killed her, but what led her to this place of profound isolation. How did a woman described as a beautiful, high-flying professional end up dying alone on her sofa, with the television as her only witness, her absence unnoticed by the world for 3 long, silent years? The answer lies in the tangled, secret history of a life that was far more complex and tragic than anyone could have possibly imagined. The discovery of Joyce Vincent's skeletal remains sparked a brief, intense flurry of media attention in the UK. The story was a shocking and morbidly fascinating parable for the modern age, a tale of urban alienation that tapped into a deep-seated, collective fear. But as quickly as it appeared, the story faded, another transient headline in the relentless 24-hour news cycle. For the world at large, Joyce Vincent became a footnote, a symbol. But for a handful of people, her story was a beginning, not an end. Chief among them was a filmmaker named Carol Morley, who read the initial small newspaper report about the discovery and found herself unable to let it go. The question of how a woman like Joyce could be so completely forgotten haunted her. She placed advertisements in London newspapers and on the side of a taxi, simply asking, "Did you know Joyce Carol Vincent?" The responses began to trickle in, and with each one, a new piece of the puzzle of Joyce's life was uncovered. The project evolved into a documentary film, Dreams of a Life, which became the primary vehicle through which the world would come to know Joyce not as a skeleton on a sofa, but as a complex, vibrant, and ultimately tragic human being. The film's investigation went far deeper than the initial police inquiry, revealing a life that was a kaleidoscope of different identities, a series of carefully constructed personas that rarely overlapped. The The Joyce that emerged from these interviews was a woman of immense charm and charisma, but also of profound emotional distance. Friends from her early life in the 1980s and 90s remembered a beautiful, stylish, and ambitious woman. She was the life of the party, always immaculately dressed, someone who could light up a room. She was intelligent and funny, but she was also intensely private. She never spoke of her family or her past. She had 4 older sisters, but for reasons that remained obscure, she had completely cut herself off from them. She would move apartments frequently, often without telling anyone where she was going. Her friends described a pattern. She would enter their lives, become a vibrant and central figure, and then, just as suddenly, she would disappear, only to resurface months or even years later with no explanation for her absence. She was a master of the geographic cure, moving from place to place as if trying to outrun a shadow that only she could see. This pattern of appearing and disappearing made her long final absence seem, to those who knew her, like just another one of Joyce's vanishing acts. They assumed she had moved on, started a new life somewhere else, as she had done so many times before. No one thought to call the police because this was simply what Joyce did. She was a woman who cultivated her own mystery. The investigation into her professional life revealed a similar trajectory. She was smart and capable, landing impressive jobs in the finance sector at major firms like Ernst & Young and Lawtemp. But she never stayed in one place for long. She would work at a company for a year or two and then move on, leaving behind a string of colleagues who remembered her fondly but knew almost nothing about her personal life. The most significant and illuminating discoveries came from the men who had been in her life. Carol Morley tracked down several of her former boyfriends, and their stories began to fill in the missing emotional landscape. They described a woman who was loving and engaging, but who always kept a part of herself hidden, a core of her being that was inaccessible. One former partner, a man named Martin, with whom she had lived for 3 years, recounted how he once came home to find her gone. Having packed her bags and left without a word, he never saw her again. Through these relationships, a darker theme began to emerge, a possible history of domestic violence. In 2001, Joyce's life took a dramatic turn. She quit her corporate job and seemed to drop out of her professional life entirely. It was around this time that she entered a relationship that her friends described as volatile and controlling. She spent a period living in a domestic abuse shelter in Haringey, a clear indication that she was in fear for her safety. This was the critical turning point. It seemed that Joyce wasn't just moving to move. She was running from someone. She had become so adept at making herself invisible to the world at large that when she truly needed to hide from a specific threat, she was devastatingly successful. Her final years were spent in the Wood Green flat, a place provided to her as social housing, likely because of her status as a victim of domestic abuse. Here, her isolation became absolute. She had successfully cut ties with her family, her old friends, and her professional colleagues. She had built a fortress of anonymity around herself. But a fortress can also be a prison. In late 2003, she was hospitalized for a peptic ulcer. It was during this hospital stay that she listed her former partner, Martin, the man she had walked out on years before, as her next of kin. He was the last person to have a meaningful, documented connection to her, a ghost from a past life she chose to invoke in a moment of medical crisis. After her release from the hospital, she returned to her flat, and it was shortly after this, around Christmas of 2003, that she is believed to have died. The presents found by her television were likely for the few remaining people in her orbit, perhaps neighbors or the social workers who had helped her, but for some reason she never delivered them. The question of whether she died from natural causes or at the hands of another remains unanswered. The open verdict from the coroner leaves both possibilities on the table. It is plausible that she suffered a fatal asthma attack, alone in her flat, unable to call for help. It is equally plausible that the person she was hiding from finally found her. An intruder could have entered the flat, caused her death, perhaps in a way that left no marks on the skeleton, like suffocation, and left, locking the door from the outside. The television being left on could have been a deliberate act to create the illusion that someone was home, a simple but effective piece of misdirection. Her history as a victim of domestic violence lends a chilling credibility to this theory. The man she was running from, whose identity was never definitively established, remains a phantom, a potential killer who may have committed the perfect, untraceable crime. But whether her death was a tragic accident or a quiet murder, the circumstances that allowed her to remain undiscovered for so long are a profound indictment of our modern, disconnected society. She lived in a building with dozens of other people, yet no one truly knew her. The systems that were meant to support her, housing benefits, automated bill payments, ironically became the very mechanisms that enabled her long, silent vigil after death, maintaining the illusion of a life being lived. Her story forces a deeply uncomfortable question upon us. Who in our own lives would notice if we were gone? It's a chilling thought, a modern horror story where the monster isn't a person, but the creeping, impersonal silence of alienation itself. Joyce Vincent's life, a vibrant and complex tapestry of ambition, love, and fear, had ended in the most absolute solitude imaginable. The story of Joyce Vincent, as we know it today, exists almost entirely because a filmmaker refused to let her be forgotten. After the initial shock of the discovery faded from the headlines, Joyce was on the verge of becoming a piece of grim urban trivia, a cautionary tale told in passing. The documentary, Dreams of a Life, became an act of profound historical and emotional rescue. It meticulously pieced together the fragments of a shattered life, transforming a skeleton on a sofa back into a woman of hopes, dreams, ambitions, and deep, hidden sorrows. For the friends and former lovers who participated, the process was a painful reckoning. They were confronted with the ghost of a woman they had all loved in their own way, and forced to face their own role in the quiet, collective failure to notice she was gone. Their recollections were filled with a palpable sense of guilt and regret. They remembered her pattern of disappearing, but had always assumed she was off somewhere living another exciting chapter of her life. It was, as many of them said, just Joyce being Joyce. This rationalization, once a simple acceptance of a friend's eccentricities, now sounded like a tragic misreading of a cry for help. The realization that her final disappearance was not a choice but a tragedy, and that her isolation was not a sign of independence but of profound distress, was a heavy burden for them to carry. Her 4 older sisters, who had been estranged from her for years, were also located. They had tried to find her over the years by hiring a private detective, but had eventually given up. The news of her death, and the lonely circumstances surrounding it, was the devastating end to a family rift that could now never be healed. The central, unanswerable question of how Joyce died looms over her entire story. The 2 prevailing theories each paint a portrait of a uniquely modern tragedy. The first, and perhaps the most likely, is that she died of natural causes. Suffering from a peptic ulcer and a severe asthma condition, it's entirely plausible that she experienced a sudden, catastrophic medical event. In this scenario, the horror lies in her absolute isolation. One can imagine her, alone in her flat, the television flickering, as she struggled for breath, unable to reach the phone, with no one to call and no one to check on her. Her death becomes a tragedy of solitude, a stark illustration of what happens when the threads connecting us to a community are severed one by one. The second theory, however, is darker and more sinister. Given her history as a victim of domestic violence and her time in a women's shelter, the possibility of foul play cannot be dismissed. The person or persons she was hiding from might have finally located her. A quiet, non-violent murder, one that left no marks on the bones, such as suffocation or a forced overdose, is terrifyingly plausible. The perpetrator could have let themselves in, committed the act, and left, leaving the television on as a deliberate distraction to mask the silence that followed. In this version of events, Joyce's carefully constructed fortress of anonymity became her tomb, a hiding place so effective that it concealed not only her life, but also her murder. Her killer, if one exists, committed the perfect crime, their identity and actions erased by the same societal indifference that erased Joyce herself. Ultimately, the cause of her death is almost secondary to the profound questions her life and death force us to confront. Joyce Vincent's story is a powerful and unsettling mirror held up to 21st century urban life. She is a ghost in the machine of our modern world. She died in a city of over 7 million people, surrounded by neighbors, yet she was utterly alone. The very systems designed for convenience and efficiency, automated bill payments, direct debit rent, became her unwitting accomplices, maintaining the facade of a functioning life long after that life had ended. The electricity stayed on, the heat continued to hum, and the television broadcast to an empty room, creating a perfect illusion that concealed a grim reality. Her story is a stark reminder that connection is more than just proximity. In an age of social media and digital communication, we have more friends than ever, but the depth of those connections can be deceptively shallow. Joyce's life serves as a cautionary tale about the difference between being known and being truly seen. She was known by many, colleagues, friends, lovers, but it seems no one was allowed to see the complete picture, the vulnerable core hidden beneath her charismatic and ever-shifting personas. The most haunting artifacts of her lonely death remain the Christmas presents. Wrapped and ready, they represent a final, unrealized gesture of connection. They are a heartbreaking symbol of a desire to reach out, to bridge the gap she had spent years creating. We will never know why they were never delivered. Perhaps she was waiting for the right moment, or perhaps her death came before she had the chance. But they sit at the heart of her mystery, a tangible representation of her last intentions, frozen in time. In the end, Joyce Vincent's death was not the result of one single failure, but of 1,000 tiny fractures in the fabric of community. It was the result of a family rift, of friendships strained by distance and her own evasiveness, of neighbors conditioned to mind their own business, and of a society that increasingly allows individuals to slip through the cracks. She became a ghost long before she died, a woman who successfully erased herself, only to have the permanence of that erasure become her most enduring and tragic legacy. Her story asks each of us to look a little closer at the people in our own lives, to listen a little more carefully to the silences, and to wonder who might be waiting, just beyond our line of sight, for a connection that might just save their life. The mystery of Joyce Vincent was hidden in the quiet hum of a lonely apartment, a secret kept by the very city that surrounded her. But sometimes, a mystery isn't hidden at all. It's written in plain sight, in a code no one can decipher, carried on the body of a man who appeared from nowhere and belonged to no one. H. Holmes and the murder castle in the late 19th century. The city of Chicago was a churning, chaotic symphony of American ambition. It was a city that had burned to the ground in 1871 and, from those ashes, had rebuilt itself with a furious, almost manic energy. It was a hub of industry, a crossroads of railways, a place of towering new skyscrapers and sprawling, filthy stockyards. It was a magnet for dreamers and grifters, for wide-eyed innocents and cold-hearted predators, all drawn to the promise of fortune and the cover of anonymity that only a metropolis of over 1 million souls could provide. And in 1893, Chicago became the stage for the grandest spectacle the world had ever seen, the World's Columbian Exposition. The World's Fair was a breathtaking vision of the future, a white city of pristine neoclassical buildings rising from the swampland of Jackson Park. It was a celebration of 400 years of progress since Columbus, a showcase of electric lights, new inventions like the Ferris wheel, and the boundless optimism of the Gilded Age. Millions of people from all over the globe flooded into Chicago to witness this marvel. They were tourists, job seekers, and adventurers, and they needed places to stay. The city swelled, its boarding houses and hotels overflowing. It was a perfect environment for a predator, a time of unprecedented opportunity for someone looking to capitalize on the endless stream of transient, hopeful people who could so easily vanish without a trace. Into this bustling, opportunity-rich environment stepped a man who would come to be seen as the dark reflection of the era's gleaming promise. He was handsome, charismatic, and impeccably dressed. He possessed an air of intelligence and medical authority, and his eyes, described by many as hypnotic, could put even the most skeptical person at ease. He called himself Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, or H. Holmes, but this was just one of many names he would use. He was born Herman Webster Mudgett in New Hampshire in 1861, and from an early age, he exhibited a chilling combination of high intelligence and a profound lack of empathy. He was fascinated by anatomy and death, and was rumored to have performed crude experiments on animals. His early life was a masterclass in deception and fraud. He attended medical school at the University of Michigan, where he honed his skills not just in medicine, but in a ghoulish side business. He would steal cadavers from the university laboratory, disfigure them, and then plant them to be discovered, claiming they were individuals who had died in accidents. He would take out insurance policies on these fictitious people and then collect the payouts. This was the blueprint for his life's work, a seamless blending of scientific knowledge, financial cunning, and a complete disregard for human life, all in the service of personal gain. After medical school, he drifted across the country, leaving a trail of scams, swindled partners, and suspicious deaths in his wake. He abandoned his wife and child, engaged in bigamy, and perfected his ability to charm his way into people's trust and then exploit it for every penny. In 1886, this wandering trail of deceit led him to Chicago. He arrived in Englewood, a working-class neighborhood on the city's south side, and it was here that he found the perfect canvas for his masterpiece of horror. Using his practiced charm, he landed a job at a drugstore on the corner of South Wallace Avenue and West 63rd Street, owned by a woman named Elizabeth S. Holton. Dr. Holmes quickly made himself indispensable. When Mrs. Holton's husband died of cancer, Holmes was a comforting presence, offering to buy the drugstore from the grieving widow. She agreed, allowing him to pay in installments. But Mrs. Holton, like so many who entered Holmes's orbit, soon disappeared under mysterious circumstances. When people asked where she had gone, Holmes would calmly explain that she had decided to move to California to be with relatives. No one questioned it. Now in full possession of the drugstore, Holmes purchased the empty lot across the street. With the World's Fair on the horizon and the city buzzing with construction and opportunity, he began to draw up plans for a grand new building. It was not to be an ordinary hotel or apartment block. It was a structure born from a uniquely monstrous imagination, a building designed not for comfort, but for capture, not for commerce, but for killing. Locals, observing its strange and seemingly endless construction, began to refer to it as the castle. The construction of the castle was a marvel of methodical deception. Holmes would hire and fire construction crews constantly, ensuring that no single group of workers ever had a complete understanding of the building's final, labyrinthine design. He would run up massive bills with suppliers and then refuse to pay, using his charm and a series of lawsuits to keep them at bay. The building itself was a 3-story architectural nightmare. The ground floor housed a new, larger drugstore and various other shops. The upper 2 floors, however, were a maze of over 100 rooms, a twisting, disorienting labyrinth designed for a single purpose: to trap, confuse, and dispose of human beings. The interior was a bizarre funhouse of dead-end hallways, staircases that led nowhere, and doors that opened onto solid brick walls. Many of the guest rooms were soundproofed and equipped with gas lines, controlled by a panel in Holmes's own office, allowing him to asphyxiate his guests at will. There were secret passages in the walls and peepholes that allowed him to spy on his tenants. There were trapdoors in the floors and chutes, greased with oil, that led directly down to the building's cellar. And it was in the cellar that the true horror of the castle was located. It was Holmes's private laboratory and morgue. It contained a dissecting table, a crematorium, and multiple pits filled with acid and quicklime. It was a factory for the efficient disposal of human bodies. Here, Holmes could strip the flesh from the bones of his victims, clean their skeletons, and then, in the ultimate act of perverse capitalism, sell the articulated skeletons and organs to the very medical schools and universities he had once attended. As the 1893 World's Fair opened, drawing millions of visitors to Chicago, the castle was ready for business. Holmes advertised it as the World's Fair Hotel, a convenient and modern lodging for the influx of tourists, particularly single young women who had come to the city seeking work as stenographers and secretaries. To these hopeful, naive arrivals, Dr. H. Holmes appeared as a handsome, successful, and trustworthy benefactor, offering them not just a place to stay, but often a job as his personal assistant. They would check into the castle, lured by the promise of a new life in the glittering white city, only to find themselves trapped in its dark, silent counterpart, a place from which there was no escape. The disappearances began, one by one, a steady, silent stream of people swallowed by a building that was, in itself, a perfect killing machine. With the world's Columbian Exposition in full swing, H. Holmes's murder castle became a human abattoir, operating with the cold efficiency of a slaughterhouse. Holmes, the charming and handsome doctor, was the perfect predator for the era. He specifically targeted young, single women who had been drawn to Chicago by the promise of the fair and the prospect of employment. These women were often new to the city, disconnected from their families, and possessed a naivety that made them vulnerable to his practiced charm. He would hire them as his personal secretaries or stenographers, a role that required them to live within the castle itself. This was a crucial part of his method. He needed his victims close, isolated within the labyrinth he had built. One of his most notable victims during this period was a woman named Emmeline Sigrand. He hired her in 1892, and she, like many others, was quickly enchanted by his charisma and apparent wealth. Holmes proposed to her, and she ecstatically accepted. But Emmeline, like the drugstore owner Mrs. Holton before her, soon vanished. When her concerned family began to make inquiries, Holmes put them off with a series of convincing lies. He told them that Emmeline had second thoughts about the marriage and had run off with another man. He even produced forged letters to support his story. The family, heartbroken but with no reason to suspect a man of Dr. Holmes's standing, eventually gave up their search. Meanwhile, Holmes sold a skeleton, which he claimed was Emmeline's, to a medical school for a handsome profit. The castle also became a macabre stage for Holmes's elaborate insurance scams. He developed a close relationship with a man named Benjamin Pitzel, a carpenter with a criminal past who became Holmes's most trusted associate and, ultimately, his most tragic victim. Pitzel was a jack of all trades, a loyal handyman who helped Holmes with some of his construction and scams. Together, they planned their most audacious fraud yet. Pitzel would fake his own death in a lab explosion. They would procure a disfigured cadaver from a medical source, pass it off as Pitzel, and then Pitzel's wife, Carrie, would collect a $10,000 life insurance policy, which she would split with Holmes. It was a classic Holmes scheme, intricate, audacious, and built on a foundation of deceit. But Holmes had no intention of splitting the money. Deception was his nature, and betrayal was his currency. Instead of using a substitute cadaver, Holmes decided to use Pitzel himself. In 1894, after the World's Fair had closed and the stream of victims had begun to dry up, he put his plan into motion. He traveled with Pitzel to Philadelphia, knocked him unconscious with chloroform, and then set his body on fire with benzene, staging it to look like a chemical accident. The body was so badly burned that it was difficult to identify, but using his medical knowledge and persuasive charm, Holmes managed to convince the authorities and the insurance investigators that the charred corpse was indeed Benjamin Pitzel. Carrie Pitzel, unaware of the true nature of her husband's death, received the $10,000 payout. Now began the most chilling and nomadic phase of Holmes's criminal career. He had the insurance money, but he also had a problem. Carrie Pitzel and her 5 children. He couldn't risk them discovering the truth. So he took them under his wing, telling the grieving widow that her husband was actually alive and hiding in London, and that he would reunite them soon. What followed was a bizarre and horrifying journey across the northern United States and into Canada. Holmes traveled with the unsuspecting Carrie and 3 of her children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, while sending the other 2 children to live with relatives. He moved them from city to city, from one rented house to another, a grim parade of deception. He was simultaneously courting Carrie, keeping her placated with lies about her husband, while systematically murdering her children. In Toronto, he locked the 2 girls, Alice and Nellie, in a large trunk, drilled a hole in the lid, and ran a gas line into it, asphyxiating them. He buried their naked bodies in the cellar of the house he had rented. He then traveled with the youngest boy, Howard, to a cottage in Irvington, Indiana. There, he killed him, dissected his body, and burned the pieces in a wood-burning stove before scattering the remains. Throughout this entire ordeal, he continued to write letters to Carrie, forging notes from her supposedly alive husband and her missing children, assuring her that everyone was fine and that their reunion was just around the corner. It was a sustained act of psychological torture, a masterpiece of cold-blooded manipulation. But Holmes's world of intricate lies was beginning to unravel. His web of scams had become too complex, and he had made too many enemies. One of his former criminal associates, a train robber named Marion Hedgepeth, whom Holmes had promised a cut of the Pittizel insurance money but had stiffed, went to the police. He told them everything he knew about Holmes's insurance fraud schemes. This gave law enforcement, particularly the Pinkerton Detective Agency, who had been hired by the insurance company to investigate the suspicious Pittizel claim, the leverage they needed. The Pinkertons began a relentless manhunt, tracking Holmes across the country. They finally caught up with him in Boston in November 1894. He was arrested, not for murder, but for an outstanding warrant related to a horse swindle in Texas. He was initially confident, believing he could charm or lie his way out of this predicament as he had so many times before. But this time was different. The lead investigator on the case, a Philadelphia detective named Frank Geyer, was a determined and methodical man who was not susceptible to Holmes's charisma. Geyer didn't believe the story about Pittizel being alive in London. He began to painstakingly retrace Holmes's twisted journey with the Pittizel children. Geyer's investigation was a masterpiece of old-fashioned detective work. He followed the cold trail from city to city, interviewing landlords, livery drivers, and anyone who might have seen the strange man traveling with the 3 children. In the cellar of the Toronto rental house, he made the first gruesome discovery, the shallow grave containing the bodies of Alice and Nellie Pittizel. He then traveled to Indiana, to the cottage in Irvington. There, sifting through the ashes of the stove, he found fragments of bone and teeth, later identified as belonging to young Howard Pittizel. The discovery of the children's bodies transformed the case. This was no longer just about insurance fraud. Holmes was now a suspected mass murderer. The press seized upon the story, and the tale of the handsome, villainous doctor and his horrific crimes captivated and terrified the nation. The focus of the investigation then shifted back to Chicago, to the mysterious, fortress-like building that the locals had nicknamed the Castle. The police, who had previously dismissed rumors about the building as fanciful, now descended upon it, ready to uncover the secrets hidden within its walls. What they were about to find would cement H. Holmes's reputation as America's first and most prolific serial killer, and turn his murder castle into a legend of pure, architectural evil. With H. Holmes in custody and the bodies of the Pittizel children discovered, the full attention of the law and a horrified public turned to the hulking, ominous structure on the corner of 63rd and Wallace in Chicago. The murder castle, once a subject of local gossip and suspicion, was now believed to be the epicenter of a killing spree of unimaginable scale. In early 1895, Chicago police and investigators began the grim task of dismantling the building, peeling back its layers of brick and mortar to reveal the secrets Holmes had so carefully walled up. The interior of the castle was a physical manifestation of its creator's mind, a chaotic, disorienting, and ruthlessly functional machine for murder. As investigators navigated the labyrinthine corridors, they uncovered the full extent of Holmes's architectural horrors. They found the soundproofed rooms and the airtight vaults, one of which was lined with iron plates and asbestos. They traced the network of gas pipes that fed into the sealed rooms, controlled by a panel hidden in Holmes's bedroom closet. They discovered the trapdoors, some concealed under rugs, which opened onto greased chutes that plunged into the darkness of the cellar. They found a secret, sealed-off room, later dubbed the hanging chamber, complete with pulleys and ropes. The entire building was a predator's den, meticulously designed to ensnare, terrify, and eliminate its prey with chilling industrial efficiency. The true heart of the horror, however, was in the basement. This was Holmes's personal abattoir and laboratory. Here, investigators found a blood-spattered dissecting table, a collection of surgical tools, and a large, custom-built crematorium with scorch marks still visible on its brick walls. There were pits filled with corrosive acid and quicklime, designed to dissolve human flesh. And buried in the dirt floor and hidden within the lime pits, they began to find the evidence they were looking for. Human bones. The remains were fragmented and mixed, making it nearly impossible to reassemble complete skeletons or determine the exact number of victims. They found piles of women's clothing, shoes, and jewelry, haunting remnants of the countless people who had checked into the World's Fair Hotel and had never checked out. The press coverage of these discoveries was sensational and breathless. Newspapers across the country ran lurid, often exaggerated, accounts of the House of Horrors. The castle became a national obsession, a symbol of the dark underbelly of the Gilded Age. The number of Holmes's victims became a subject of wild speculation. The press claimed he had murdered as many as 200 people, a number that, while likely inflated, captured the public's perception of the scale of his evil. The true number is impossible to know, but investigators were able to confirm at least 9 murders, with strong evidence suggesting many more. Faced with the overwhelming evidence against him, Holmes, ever the performer, decided to confess. But his confession was just another performance, another manipulation. He sold his story to the Hearst newspaper syndicate for a handsome sum. It was a rambling, self-aggrandizing narrative filled with lies and contradictions. He initially confessed to 27 murders, but many of the people he named were later found to be alive and well. He seemed to be playing a final, macabre game with the public and the law, trying to control his own legend even from behind bars. His trial, held in Philadelphia in the fall of 1895, was for a single crime, the murder of his associate Benjamin Pittesel. The prosecution, not wanting to get bogged down in the complex and largely circumstantial evidence from the castle, focused on the one case they could prove beyond a shadow of a doubt. Holmes, acting as his own attorney, put on a brilliant, charismatic defense. He was articulate, calm, and persuasive, but the evidence, particularly Frank Geyer's meticulous account of his search for the Pittesel children, was too powerful. The jury took only 6 hours to find him guilty. He was sentenced to death by hanging. While awaiting his execution, Holmes wrote a detailed memoir. In it, he recanted his previous confession, claiming he was innocent of everything except the deaths of 2 women who he said had died in his care during illegal abortions. He even claimed that Pittesel was still alive. He went to his death maintaining an aura of defiant mystery. On May 7, 1896, at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia, H. Holmes was executed. The hanging itself was reportedly botched. His neck did not snap instantly, and he twitched on the end of the rope for over 15 minutes before being pronounced dead. In his final will, he made a strange and specific request: that his coffin be filled with cement and buried in an unmarked grave 10 feet deep. He was terrified, it seemed, that his own body would be stolen and dissected by medical students, the very ghoulish trade he had once practiced himself. The murder castle did not stand for long. In August 1895, shortly after the investigation concluded, it was gutted by a mysterious fire, likely the work of arsonists seeking to cleanse the neighborhood of its dark presence. The burned-out shell was eventually torn down, and today, a post office stands on the site where so much horror unfolded. The legacy of H. Holmes is that of America's first modern bogeyman. He was a creature of his time, a man who exploited the anonymity and rapid social change of the Gilded Age to commit acts of unspeakable evil. He was a con artist, a bigamist, a swindler, and a mass murderer, a man who saw other human beings not as people, but as raw materials to be used and discarded for profit. While the sensationalized number of 200 victims is a product of yellow journalism, the confirmed reality of his crimes is horrifying enough. He represents a uniquely American type of evil, one that is not born of passion or madness, but of cold, rational, and entrepreneurial self-interest. He built a factory for killing, a dark mirror to the industrial innovation celebrated at the World's Fair, and in doing so, carved his name into the annals of criminal history as one of the most chilling and prolific serial killers the world has ever known. The horrors of the murder castle were contained within its walls, a private hell built by a single evil mind. But some mysteries are not confined to one place. They stretch across landscapes and jurisdictions, leaving a trail of victims that points to a phantom who haunts the edges of our society. The Gilgo Beach murders. There are places on the edges of our sprawling modern world that seem to exist outside of time. Ocean Parkway on the south shore of Long Island is one such place. It is a thin, 15-mile ribbon of asphalt that runs along a remote barrier island, a desolate stretch of land separating the Great South Bay from the vast, gray expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. For most of the year, it is a place of windswept solitude. To the north, dense, almost impenetrable thickets of poison ivy, thorny brambles, and stunted coastal pines. To the south, rolling sand dunes and the endless, rhythmic crash of the surf. It is a landscape of stark, lonely beauty, a place people drive through to get somewhere else. To the summer communities of Jones Beach or Fire Island, it is not a destination in itself. It's a liminal space, a place on the periphery, and for years, it held a terrible secret. The story that would ultimately unearth that secret began not with a body, but with a frantic, terrified cry for help in the dead of night. On May 1st, 2010, a 24-year-old woman from New Jersey named Shannon Gilbert made a 23-minute 911 call from the quiet, gated community of Oak Beach, a small enclave of waterfront homes situated just off the parkway. Shannon worked as an escort, and she had traveled to Oak Beach that night for an appointment arranged through Craigslist. But something had gone horribly wrong. The 911 call itself is a haunting, fragmented document of pure terror. "They're trying to kill me," Shannon screamed at the dispatcher, her voice a mixture of panic and confusion. Over the course of the call, the dispatcher tried to ascertain her location, but Shannon was disoriented. At times, she seemed to be speaking to her driver, who was waiting outside, and to the client inside the house. Then, the call captured the sound of her fleeing the client's home, her footsteps pounding on the pavement as she ran into the night. She began frantically knocking on the doors of neighboring houses, her screams echoing through the quiet, sleeping community. One resident, an elderly man named Gus Coletti, heard her pleas and called 911 himself. Another neighbor let her into his home, but she quickly fled again. The last moments of the call are a terrifying void. Shannon Gilbert, running into the dense, dark thicket that bordered the community, simply vanished. The initial police investigation focused on finding Shannon. The Suffolk County Police Department treated it as a missing person case, albeit one with deeply disturbing circumstances. They searched the immediate vicinity of Oak Beach, a difficult and punishing terrain. But after the initial searches yielded nothing, the case began to grow cold. Shannon's family, particularly her mother, Mari, refused to let her be forgotten. They relentlessly pushed the police, kept her story in the media, and insisted that the department take her disappearance seriously. For 7 months, the search continued intermittently with little progress. Then, in early December 2010, a Suffolk County police officer named John Malia was conducting a routine training exercise with his canine partner, a cadaver dog named Blue. Given the ongoing search for Shannon, they decided to conduct the exercise along the desolate northern shoulder of Ocean Parkway, just a few miles from where she was last seen. It was a cold, windswept day. As they moved along the edge of the thicket, the dog, Blue, suddenly signaled a hit. Officer Malia pushed through the dense, thorny brush. There, lying in the undergrowth, he found what looked like the skeletal remains of a human being, partially concealed within a rotting burlap sack. The initial assumption was that they had found Shannon Gilbert, but a quick examination revealed this was not the case. The remains were too old. This was someone else entirely. The discovery was chilling. It suggested that something far more sinister was at play along this lonely stretch of highway. The police immediately sealed off the area and began a full-scale, methodical search. What had begun as a training exercise had just become a major homicide investigation. Just 2 days later, on December 13th, the search teams found 3 more bodies, all within a quarter mile of the first. Like the first victim, each was just skeletal remains, wrapped in decaying burlap, and dumped unceremoniously in the dense, thorny brush just a few feet from the road. The police now knew they were not dealing with an isolated incident. They were dealing with a serial killer's dumping ground. As forensic analysis began, the identities of these first 4 victims came into focus, and a terrifying pattern emerged. They were all young women who, like Shannon Gilbert, had been working as escorts and advertising their services online. The first body found was identified as Melissa Barthelemy, who had vanished from the Bronx in 2009. The other 3 were Maureen Brainerd Barnes, who disappeared from Manhattan in 2007, Megan Waterman, last seen at a hotel in Hauppauge, Long Island, in June of 2010, and Amber Lynn Costello, who vanished from her home in North Babylon, also on Long Island, just 2 months before the bodies were found. Law enforcement, and soon the public, began to refer to them as the Gilgo Four. The similarities in their cases were undeniable. They were all petite women, all working in the same trade, and all disposed of in the same ritualistic manner. This was the work of a single, organized, and forensically aware predator. The killer, dubbed the Long Island Serial Killer, or LISK, had been using this desolate stretch of Ocean Parkway as his private cemetery for years, operating completely under the radar. The investigation into the victims' lives revealed another chilling detail that spoke to the killer's brazen cruelty. After Melissa Barthelemy's disappearance in 2009, her teenage sister began to receive a series of taunting, torturous phone calls. The calls came from Melissa's own cell phone. The man on the other end was cold and abusive, at one point claiming to have killed Melissa. Using cell tower data, police traced the calls to crowded, bustling areas in the heart of Manhattan, near Madison Square Garden and Times Square. The killer was hiding in plain sight, using the anonymity of the city to torment the family of the woman he had murdered. A ghost who could move with impunity between the chaos of the city and the desolation of the coast. As the winter of 2010 wore on, a profound sense of dread settled over Long Island. The search for one missing woman had torn back the veil on a much older and more terrifying mystery. The police were no longer just looking for Shannon Gilbert. They were hunting a phantom, a killer who had been preying on vulnerable women for years, using the internet as his hunting ground and the lonely shores of Long Island as his graveyard. And the most terrifying question of all was not who the killer was, but how many more victims lay hidden in the dense, unforgiving bramble along Ocean Parkway. The search was only just beginning. As the investigation intensified in the spring of 2011, what began as the search for one killer's dumping ground evolved into a far more complex and sprawling mystery. The Suffolk County Police, now working in conjunction with the New York State Police and the FBI, expanded their search grid along Ocean Parkway. The scale of the operation was immense. Officers, equipped with machetes and search poles, painstakingly combed through the dense, poison ivy-choked thickets that lined the highway. It was a grueling, physically demanding task, made all the more grim by the constant expectation of what they might find. In late March and early April, their worst fears were realized. The search began to yield more human remains, but these new discoveries did not fit the established pattern of the Gilgo Four. First, on March 29th, they found the partial remains of a young woman who was eventually identified as Jessica Taylor. Taylor, who had also worked as an escort, had vanished from New York City 8 years earlier, in 2003. Crucially, other parts of her dismembered body had been discovered years before, in 2003, dumped in a wooded area nearly 45 miles away in Manorville, a town in the central part of Long Island. This was a shocking development. It suggested the killer, or killers, had more than one dumping ground, and that their reign of terror extended much further back in time and across a wider geographic area than anyone had initially suspected. The discoveries continued to mount. On April 4th, the search uncovered 3 more sets of remains. One was an unidentified man, an Asian male believed to be between 17 and 23 years old, dressed in women's clothing. His cause of death was blunt force trauma. The second was a female toddler, estimated to be around 2 years old. The third was the toddler's mother, whose dismembered body was found in a separate location. Through DNA testing, the toddler was identified as the daughter of a woman whose torso had been found stuffed in a suitcase in Hempstead Lake State Park back in 1997. The woman herself, who became known as Peaches because of a distinctive tattoo on her breast, remains unidentified to this day. This discovery was profoundly disturbing, expanding the timeline of the murders back to the mid-1990s and introducing victims who were not escorts, including a man and a child. The investigation was now a labyrinth of interconnected, yet distinct, cases. Were all these victims the work of one killer? Or were the police dealing with multiple predators who had all chosen this same desolate stretch of coastline as their disposal site? The differences in the victims' profiles and the methods of disposal, some dismembered, others left whole, muddied the waters. The case of the Asian male, nicknamed John Doe, and Peaches and her child seemed to be the work of a different, perhaps even more brutal, killer than the one who had targeted the Gilgo Four. The complexity of the case was compounded by interagency rivalries and a perceived lack of transparency from the Suffolk County Police Department. The families of the victims grew increasingly frustrated, feeling that the department was withholding information and not pursuing the investigation with enough vigor. The case became a political hot potato, with different law enforcement officials and politicians offering conflicting theories and public statements. One prominent theory, pushed by some officials, was that Shannon Gilbert's death was unrelated to the other victims. They suggested she had drowned accidentally in the nearby marsh while in a state of drug-induced panic. This theory was vehemently rejected by her family, who believed she was a victim of the same predator, or had stumbled upon something related to the murders that led to her death. This debate over Shannon's fate was finally put to rest in December 2011, more than a year and a half after she disappeared. Her skeletal remains were found in the very marsh she had run into on that terrifying night. Her purse, containing her ID, cell phone, and jeans, was found a quarter-mile away. An independent autopsy commissioned by her family concluded that her injuries were consistent with homicidal strangulation, directly contradicting the police theory of an accidental drowning. Though her case has never been officially linked to the other Gilgo victims, her disappearance remains the catalyst that brought a serial killer's hidden graveyard to light. As the years went by, the investigation seemed to stall. There were no new major discoveries, and no arrests were made. The case became a source of endless speculation for amateur sleuths and true crime enthusiasts. Several potential suspects were publicly named or investigated over the years, but none were ever charged. One was a local doctor who lived in Oak Beach and had a history of hiring prostitutes. Another was James Burke, the former Suffolk County Police Chief himself, a man who was later convicted on unrelated charges of corruption and obstruction of justice. His known association with sex workers and his efforts to block FBI involvement in the Gilgo case made him a subject of intense suspicion, but no direct evidence ever linked him to the murders. The case seemed destined to join the long list of America's great, unsolved serial killer mysteries. The trail had gone cold. The victims' families were left in a state of perpetual limbo, their grief compounded by the lack of answers and justice. But technology, the very thing the killer had used to find his victims, was quietly advancing in the background. DNA analysis, which had been in its relative infancy when the first bodies were discovered, was becoming exponentially more powerful. Genetic genealogy, the same technique that had famously led to the capture of the Golden State Killer, offered a new ray of hope. Old, degraded DNA samples that were once unusable could now potentially yield a name. The ghost who had haunted Long Island for decades was about to discover that even the most carefully constructed anonymity could be shattered by a single, microscopic strand of genetic code left behind at a crime scene. A new task force was formed in 2022, bringing a fresh set of eyes and new technology to bear on the cold, hard evidence that had been sitting in storage for over a decade. The hunt was on again, this time with tools the killer could never have anticipated. For over a decade, the Gilgo Beach case remained frozen in time, a chilling monument to a killer's success and law enforcement's frustration. The names of the victims, Melissa, Maureen, Megan, Amber, Jessica, and the unidentified souls known only as Peaches, John Doe and Jane Doe, were a constant, haunting reminder of justice denied. The families lived with an open wound, their hope for answers dwindling with each passing year. But beneath the surface of the cold case, a quiet revolution was taking place. The new Gilgo Beach Task Force, formed in 2022, began to re-examine the evidence with a fresh and powerful arsenal of forensic tools. breathing new life into the stagnant investigation. The breakthrough came from a single, critical piece of evidence that had been collected more than a decade earlier. A male hair found on the burlap sack used to wrap the body of Megan Waterman. In the early days of the investigation, the DNA extracted from this hair was insufficient for a conclusive match. But by 2022, advances in mitochondrial DNA and other sensitive testing methods allowed forensic scientists to build a much more robust genetic profile. This profile was then cross-referenced with public genetic genealogy databases, a process that can identify a suspect by finding their distant relatives who have voluntarily submitted their DNA. The search yielded a match pointing not to the killer himself, but to his family tree. The task force now had a name, a target who had been living in plain sight all along. Rex Hoyerman, a 59-year-old architect and architectural consultant. Hoyerman was, on the surface, the polar opposite of a serial killer stereotype. He was a married father of two, a successful businessman who ran his own firm, RH Consultants and Associates, from an office in the heart of Manhattan. He lived in a modest, somewhat dilapidated house in Massapequa Park, a quiet suburban town on Long Island, just a short drive from where the bodies had been found. He was a man who had lived in the same house his entire life, a fixture in his community. He was, to all outward appearances, completely unremarkable. Armed with this new lead, investigators began a period of intense, covert surveillance. They trailed Hoyerman, meticulously documenting his movements. They began to build a case, brick by painstaking brick, connecting this seemingly ordinary family man to the monstrous crimes. They subpoenaed his old cell phone records, which revealed a disturbing pattern. He had used multiple burner phones to contact his victims, and the pings from these phones at the time of the disappearances corresponded to locations in both Midtown Manhattan, near his office, and Massapequa Park, near his home. The taunting calls made to Melissa Barthelomy's sister had originated from the area around his Manhattan office. The final, definitive piece of the puzzle came from a discarded pizza box. In early 2023, surveillance teams watched as Hoyerman threw a pizza box into a public garbage can in Manhattan. They quickly retrieved it. The crusts left inside were sent to the crime lab. The DNA extracted from the leftover pizza crust was a perfect match to the mitochondrial DNA from the male hair found on Megan Waterman's burlap sack. They had him. The ghost of Gilgo Beach finally had a face. On July 13, 2023, Rex Hoyerman was arrested on a busy Manhattan street as he was leaving his office. The news of his arrest sent a shockwave through Long Island and the entire country. The quiet architect, the commuter who took the train into the city every day, was charged with the murders of Melissa Barthelomy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. He was also named as the prime suspect in the murder of Maureen Brainerd Barnes, the last of the Gilgo Four. As investigators descended on his small red house in Massapequa Park, the full, chilling reality of his double life began to come into focus. The house was a cluttered, almost hoarder-like environment, a stark contrast to his organized professional life. The search of the property was a massive undertaking, lasting nearly 2 weeks. They dug up his backyard with heavy machinery, searching for more evidence or potential victims. Inside the house, they found a chilling collection, a soundproofed vault in the basement, and a massive arsenal of over 200 firearms. They also discovered the burner phones he had allegedly used to contact the victims. A crucial piece of evidence was found on his computer, a search history filled with sadistic pornography and disturbing, meticulous research into the Gilgo Beach investigation itself. He had been obsessively following the case for years, tracking the police's progress and the media coverage of his own crimes. Investigators believe that Hoyerman committed the murders during periods when his wife and children were out of town, giving him the privacy he needed to carry out his horrific acts. This detail painted a picture of a man with a monstrously compartmentalized life, a man who could seamlessly switch from being a family man and a respected professional to a sadistic, calculating predator. While Rex Hoyerman currently stands charged only with the murders of 3 of the Gilgo Four, the investigation is far from over. Authorities are now re-examining the other unsolved murders, trying to determine if Hoyerman is responsible for some, or all, of the other remains found along Ocean Parkway. The cases of Jessica Taylor, Peaches, and her child, and the unidentified male victim are all being looked at through the new lens of Hoyerman's alleged guilt. The discovery of his vast gun collection and the soundproofed vault has raised the terrifying possibility that the crimes may have been even more extensive than previously imagined. The arrest of Rex Hoyerman is a testament to the power of forensic science and the dogged persistence of law enforcement and the victims' families. It brought a sense of relief and a glimmer of justice to a community that had lived under a shadow of fear for over a decade. But it also serves as a profoundly unsettling reminder of the darkness that can hide behind the most ordinary of facades. The monster of Gilgo Beach was not a transient drifter or a shadowy figure on the fringes of society. He was a husband, a father, and a businessman. He was a neighbor. He was one of us. His case forces us to confront the terrifying reality that the most monstrous acts are often committed by those who have perfected the art of appearing completely, horrifyingly normal. The murder of Kitty Genovese in the early months of 1964, the neighborhood of Kew Gardens in Queens, New York, was a picture of tranquil, middle-class stability. It was a place of Tudor-style homes and quiet, tree-lined streets, a peaceful enclave that felt a world away from the grit and chaos of Manhattan, yet was connected to it by a short train ride. It was a community of families and professionals, a place where people knew their neighbors, where the rhythms of life were predictable and safe. It was, by all accounts, a good neighborhood, the kind of place people moved to escape the anonymity and danger of the big city. But on a cold March night, the perceived safety of Kew Gardens would be shattered, and the neighborhood would become the stage for a crime that would force an entire nation to confront a dark and deeply uncomfortable question about itself. At the center of this story was a woman named Catherine Susan Genovese, known to everyone as Kitty. At 28 years old, Kitty was a vibrant and energetic figure, a woman who defied the quieter conventions of her neighborhood. She was sharp, witty, and fiercely independent. She worked as the manager of a bar in Hollis, Queens, a job that required a tough demeanor and a keen understanding of people. She was a woman who was in control of her life, known for her confident stride and her bright red Fiat sports car, a small splash of color and speed in a world of beige family sedans. She lived in an apartment in Kew Gardens with her partner, Mary and Zilanko. They had built a life together, a small, private world of shared dreams and quiet domesticity. On the night of March 12, 1964, Kitty finished her late shift at the bar. She got into her red Fiat and began the familiar drive home. The streets were quiet, the city settling into the deep, cold stillness of a late winter night. It was after 3 a.m. by the time she arrived back in Kew Gardens on Friday, March 13th. She parked her car in a designated spot at the local Long Island Railroad station, about 100 feet from the door to her apartment building. As she turned off the engine and stepped out into the crisp, cold air, she noticed a figure emerging from the shadows at the far end of the parking lot. A sense of unease, the primal instinct of a woman walking alone in the dark, washed over her. She quickened her pace, her keys clutched in her hand. The figure began to walk towards her, his steps quickening to match hers. Panic set in. Kitty broke into a run, racing toward the perceived safety of a police call box on the corner. But she never made it. The man caught up to her, a stranger in the streetlight's glare. He grabbed her, and in that instant, the quiet order of Kew Gardens was broken. The man was Winston Mosley, a 29-year-old business machine operator, a married father of 2 with no prior criminal record. He was, by his own later confession, simply out to kill a woman. He plunged a hunting knife into Kitty's back. The pain was sharp, unimaginable. Kitty screamed, a raw, piercing cry for help that cut through the night's silence. "Oh my God! He stabbed me! Help me! Help me!" Her screams echoed off the walls of the surrounding apartment buildings, where hundreds of people lay sleeping. Lights began to flicker on in the windows above. A man's voice, belonging to a neighbor named Robert Moser, shouted down from his apartment window, "Leave that girl alone!" Winston Mosley, startled by the voice and the sudden attention, stopped his attack. He looked up at the illuminated windows, turned, and walked calmly back to his car. He got in and drove away. The immediate threat seemed to have passed. The lights in the windows began to go out, one by one. The neighbors, having seen the attacker leave, likely assumed the incident was over. Perhaps it was a drunken brawl, a domestic dispute that had been resolved. They went back to bed, but Kitty was grievously wounded. She staggered to her feet, clutching her bleeding back, and began a slow, painful journey toward her apartment building. She managed to make it around the corner, out of sight of the main street, to a small, locked vestibule at the rear entrance of the building. She collapsed against the door, just feet from the safety of her own home, but unable to get inside. She was hidden now, concealed from the view of the street and the windows above. Winston Moseley, meanwhile, had not gone far. He had simply driven around the block, changed his hat, and parked his car again. He was a methodical, patient predator. He returned to the scene on foot and began to search for his victim. He methodically checked the apartment buildings, looking for any sign of the woman he had stabbed. It took him nearly 10 minutes, but he eventually found her, a crumpled, bleeding figure lying in the dimly lit entryway at the back of the building. The door was locked, but Moseley, undeterred, went back to his car, retrieved a tool, and forced the lock. He slipped inside the small, enclosed space with his dying victim. Here, in the shadows, hidden from the view of any potential witnesses, he began his second and final assault. Kitty, weakened and bleeding, was no match for him. Her cries were weaker now, muffled by the enclosed space. The attack was brutal and prolonged. Inside his apartment, directly above the vestibule, a neighbor named Carl Ross heard the faint sounds of the struggle. He knew something was terribly wrong, but he was paralyzed by fear. He later said he didn't want his wife to become a widow. He couldn't bring himself to open his door. Instead, he cracked it open just enough to see the assault taking place on the floor below. After Moseley had finished, Ross watched him leave. He then made a phone call, not to the police, but to another neighbor, asking for advice on what to do. That neighbor, after some hesitation, finally called the police. By the time the police arrived, just a few minutes after the call, it was far too late. They found Kitty Genovese barely alive, lying in a pool of her own blood in the vestibule. She was rushed to the hospital but died in the ambulance on the way. The entire ordeal, from the first stab wound to the final fatal assault, had taken more than half an hour. The initial police reports noted the strange fact that several neighbors had heard screams, but the true, horrifying nature of the crime, the story of a public murder that had played out in stages while an entire neighborhood seemed to sleep, had not yet come to light. That revelation, when it came, would be more shocking to the world than the crime itself. In the immediate aftermath of the murder, the investigation by the New York City Police Department was swift and efficient. The crime itself, while brutal, was not initially seen as anything more than a tragic but sadly common big city homicide. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, and within a few days, a lucky break led them directly to the killer. A neighbor reported that his new color television set had been stolen during a burglary a few nights after the murder. The description of the suspect, a man seen carrying the TV, led police to Winston Moseley. When they arrested him, they found Kitty Genovese's red Fiat parked in his driveway. Under questioning, Moseley quickly confessed, not just to the murder of Kitty Genovese, but to 2 other murders and numerous burglaries and sexual assaults across Queens. His confession was chilling in its detached, matter-of-fact tone. He described his motive for killing Kitty in the simplest, most terrifying terms. He had a wife and children, he had just gotten off his night shift, and he just wanted to kill a woman. He had no connection to Kitty. She was simply the first person he saw. The case could have ended there. A random, senseless murder solved, a killer brought to justice. Winston Moseley was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. A sentence later commuted to life in prison. But the story of Kitty Genovese was about to transcend the facts of its own crime. The real story, the one that would become a permanent part of the American psyche, began 2 weeks later, during a casual lunch between the New York City Police Commissioner Michael J. Murphy and A.M. Rosenthal, the metropolitan editor of the New York Times. The commissioner, in an offhand comment, mentioned the strange and disturbing details of the Genovese case. The fact that the attack had occurred over a prolonged period and that numerous people had heard or seen something, yet had failed to intervene or even call the police. Rosenthal was stunned. He saw a story that was far more profound and disturbing than a simple murder. This was a story about the city itself, about the nature of responsibility, and about a potential sickness in the heart of modern society. He assigned one of his best reporters, Martin Gansberg, to dig deeper. Gansberg spent a week in Kew Gardens, interviewing residents and combing through police reports. The article he wrote, published on the front page of the New York Times on March 27, 1964, began with a now famous and chilling sentence. For more than half an hour, 38 respectable, law-abiding citizens in Queens watched a killer stalk and stab a woman in 3 separate attacks in Kew Gardens. The article was an explosive piece of journalism. It painted a damning portrait of a community paralyzed by apathy and indifference. It detailed how witness after witness had seen parts of the attack from their apartment windows, heard Kitty's desperate screams, and had done nothing. The story recounted quotes from neighbors explaining their inaction. One couple said they thought it was a lover's quarrel. Another man admitted he didn't want to get involved. The article created a narrative of a callous, dehumanized urban populace, so alienated from one another that they could watch a woman be murdered and then simply turn off their lights and go back to sleep. The public reaction was immediate and immense. The story was picked up by newspapers and television stations across the country and around the world. The term Kew Gardens became a national shorthand for urban decay and moral cowardice. The case became a subject of intense sociological and psychological debate. It gave birth to a now famous psychological theory known as the bystander effect or Genovese syndrome. This theory, developed by psychologists Bibb Latané and John Darley, posits that the presence of other people discourages an individual from intervening in an emergency situation. The responsibility to act becomes diffused among the group, with each person assuming someone else will take action. The 38 witnesses of Kew Gardens became the textbook example of this phenomenon. Their inaction studied in psychology classes for generations to come. The story of the 38 silent witnesses became a modern parable, a defining myth of the 20th century. It confirmed the worst fears many Americans had about the soullessness of city life. It resonated so deeply because it touched a universal nerve, forcing people everywhere to ask themselves a deeply uncomfortable question. What would I have done? The narrative was powerful, simple, and terrifying. But there was a problem with this narrative. While it was emotionally compelling and psychologically influential, it wasn't entirely true. In the decades that followed, further investigation and re-examination of the case, most notably by Kitty's younger brother, Bill Genovese, in the 2015 documentary The Witness, revealed that the story presented by the New York Times was a significant oversimplification and, in some key aspects, a distortion of the facts. The number 38, for instance, was an exaggeration. It wasn't 38 people who had witnessed the murder itself, but 38 people who the police had interviewed who had heard or seen something that night, often without understanding its significance. Many had heard faint cries but dismissed them as noise from a nearby bar or a domestic argument. The 3 attacks were not all in plain sight. The second, fatal attack occurred in the rear vestibule of the building, a location that was not visible from most of the apartments. Only one person, Carl Ross, actually witnessed the final assault, and his inaction was born of paralyzing fear, not apathy. Furthermore, the idea that no one called the police was also incorrect. At least 2 calls were made to the police, but the police response was flawed. The first call, made by Robert Moser after he shouted at Mosley, was not logged as an emergency and was not immediately acted upon. The second call, from the neighbor Carl Ross had contacted, was the one that finally brought police to the scene, but it came too late. The story was not one of complete, universal inaction, but rather a more complex and tragic tapestry of confusion, fear, misinterpretation, and a flawed emergency response system. The neighbors were not monstrously apathetic. They were human beings caught in a confusing and terrifying situation, who acted imperfectly. The Times article, while based on real events, had sensationalized them, creating a powerful myth that overshadowed the more nuanced and complicated reality. The newspaper, in its quest for a compelling story about urban decay, had inadvertently villainized an entire neighborhood and created a legend that would be nearly impossible to correct. The residents of Kew Gardens became pariahs, their community forever branded with a mark of shame. The legacy of Kitty Genovese's murder was now twofold. There was the tragic reality of her death, and the powerful, enduring, but flawed myth that her death had created. This myth, for better or for worse, would go on to have a profound and lasting impact on American society, an impact that is still felt to this day. The myth of the 38 silent witnesses, though factually flawed, took on a life of its own and had a profound and lasting impact on American society and law. The intense public soul-searching that followed the publication of the New York Times article led to tangible, real-world changes. The case became a catalyst for a national conversation about civic responsibility and the role of emergency services. One of the most significant and direct consequences of the Genovese case was the development and implementation of the 911 emergency call system. Prior to 1968, there was no universal, centralized number for emergencies in the United States. A person needing help had to know the specific, often 7-digit, number for their local police or fire department, a difficult task in a moment of panic. The confusion and delayed police response in the Genovese case highlighted the desperate need for a simple, memorable, and unified system. Spurred by the national debate her murder ignited, the federal government began to push for the creation of just such a system. In 1968, the first 911 call was made in Haleyville, Alabama, and the system gradually spread across the country, becoming the standard we know today. In a very real and direct way, the tragedy of Kitty Genovese's death helped create a system that has saved countless lives since. The case also had a significant impact on law. It spurred the creation of Good Samaritan laws in many states, statutes designed to protect individuals who offer assistance to those in peril from civil or criminal liability. These laws were crafted to counteract the fear of getting involved, the very sentiment that the Times article had so famously highlighted. The story of Kitty Genovese became a permanent fixture in the training of police officers, paramedics, and social workers, serving as a powerful case study in community response and the psychology of emergencies. Despite these positive societal changes, the personal legacy for the residents of Kew Gardens was one of pain and misrepresentation. For decades, they lived under the shadow of the myth, branded as heartless and apathetic. The man who shouted from the window, Robert Moser, and the woman who cradled Kitty in her arms as she lay dying, Sophia Farrar, were largely written out of the popular narrative. Their actions didn't fit the simple, damning story of 38 people who did nothing. The reality of their fear, confusion, and, in some cases, their attempts to help, was lost in the glare of the powerful myth. Carl Ross, the neighbor who witnessed the final attack but was too afraid to act, was particularly haunted. He lived the rest of his life as a recluse, tormented by the decision he made that night. The true story, as it has been painstakingly reconstructed in recent years, is less a simple morality play and more a complex human tragedy. It's a story about the ambiguity of sound in a dense urban environment, where a scream for help can be mistaken for a drunken laugh. It's a story about the very real and paralyzing effects of fear. And it's a story about the systemic failures of a pre-9/11 world, where the lines of communication between citizens and their protectors were fragile and easily broken. The life of Kitty Genovese herself was also largely erased by the myth. She was reduced to a one-dimensional symbol. The victim, her vibrant personality, her independence, her career, and her relationship with Mary and Zielonko were all overshadowed by the final 30 minutes of her life. The documentary The Witness, spearheaded by her brother Bill, was a powerful attempt to reclaim her identity, to show the world the woman who was lost, not just the symbol that was created. For her family, the fight was not just about correcting the historical record, but about restoring her humanity. Winston Moseley, the man at the center of the crime, became a footnote in his own story. He escaped from prison in 1968, held a family hostage, and was recaptured after a massive manhunt. He spent over 50 years in prison, becoming one of the state's longest-serving inmates, and was denied parole 18 times. He died in prison in 2016 at the age of 81, having shown little remorse for his crimes. In the end, the story of Kitty Genovese is a powerful example of how a narrative can become more real than reality itself. The myth of the 38 silent witnesses, while a distortion, tapped into a deep and genuine anxiety about the changing nature of American life. It articulated a fear that our cities were making us colder, more isolated, and less human. While the facts of that night in Kew Gardens were more complex, the myth served as a necessary catalyst for change. It forced a national reckoning that led to concrete improvements in our emergency response systems and a deeper understanding of our own social psychology. Kitty Genovese's legacy, therefore, is a paradox. Her tragic, lonely death, amplified and mythologized by the media, ultimately fostered a greater sense of collective responsibility. The story of 38 people who supposedly did nothing inspired a system that has empowered millions to do something. Her name became synonymous with the bystander effect, but her story also became the driving force behind the creation of the very tool that is most often used to overcome it. A simple, 3-digit number that connects us to help and to each other in our darkest moments. The murder of Kitty Genovese forced a city to look at the darkness within its own communities. But some crimes are so bizarre, so alien, that they seem to come from another world entirely, leaving behind physical evidence that defies all rational explanation. The lead Masks case, there are certain places on Earth that seem to exist at the threshold of another world, where the veil between the known and the unknowable feels particularly thin. Vintam Hill, a sprawling, verdant peak overlooking the Guanabara Bay near Niterói, Brazil, is one such place. By day, it is a place of rugged, natural beauty, offering stunning panoramic views of Rio de Janeiro and the iconic Sugarloaf Mountain. But as dusk falls, its isolated trails and dense, subtropical vegetation take on a more mysterious character. It is a place of deep silences and long shadows, a landscape that has long been a focal point for local legends, tales of mysterious lights in the sky, and strange, inexplicable occurrences. For decades, residents in the surrounding areas have spoken of glowing orbs and silent, hovering craft seen in the skies above the hill, making it a locus for those fascinated by the paranormal and the extraterrestrial. On the afternoon of Saturday, August 20th, 1966, an 18-year-old local youth named Jorge da Costa Alves was flying a kite on the slopes of a neighboring hill. A sudden gust of wind caught his kite, and he watched it drift away, coming to rest somewhere in the dense, less-traveled wilderness of Vintam Hill. Determined to retrieve it, Jorge began making his way into the unfamiliar and overgrown terrain. As he pushed deeper into the brush, following the tangled line of his kite string, he stumbled into a small, secluded clearing, and there, he found something that had nothing to do with his lost kite. Something so bizarre and unsettling that it would become etched into the folklore of Brazil forever. Lying on their backs in a small patch of ground that had been deliberately cleared of weeds and debris were the bodies of 2 men. They were arranged with a strange, almost ceremonial neatness, lying side by side as if they had simply laid down for a nap. The initial shock of the discovery was compounded by the sheer strangeness of the scene. The men were dressed impeccably in smart, matching suits and pristine, waterproof raincoats, formal attire that was utterly out of place in the humid, muddy wilderness. The ground around them was damp from recent rains, but their raincoats were clean. There were no signs of a struggle, no obvious wounds, no indication of any violence having taken place. It was a scene of eerie, inexplicable peace. Jorge, terrified by his discovery, fled the hill and ran home to tell his mother. She, like many parents, dismissed it as the product of an overactive teenage imagination. Unsure of what to do, and perhaps afraid of not being believed, Jorge did not go to the police. For 4 days, the 2 men lay undisturbed in their secret clearing on the hill. The story might have ended there. Another strange tale told by a local boy, had it not been for Jorge's persistence. On August 24th, he convinced 2 friends to go back with him to prove he wasn't lying. When they reached the clearing, the scene was unchanged. The 2 men were still there, their bodies now noticeably bloating and decomposing in the tropical heat. Convinced and horrified, the group raced to notify the authorities. A team of police officers and firefighters was dispatched to Vintham Hill. The climb was arduous, and the remote location of the clearing meant that a full investigation would be difficult. When they arrived, the officers were confronted with the same baffling tableau. The chief of police, José Venancio Bittencourt, later described it as a perfect mystery. The bodies lay on a bed of pine needles that seemed to have been carefully laid out. Near them, the police found a small collection of equally strange objects: an empty bottle of mineral water, a small packet containing 2 wet towels, a handkerchief with the initials MAS, and a single, standard sheet of lead. And then there were the objects that gave the case its enduring, haunting name. Placed over the eyes of each man was a crude, handmade mask. They were fashioned from sheets of lead, carefully cut and smoothed into the shape of a pair of rudimentary spectacles. The masks had no straps and no eye holes. They were designed simply to rest over the orbital area. They were not instruments of torture or restraint. They appeared to be protective, like some form of primitive shielding against an unseen force. As the police carefully documented the scene, searching for any clue that could explain this bizarre diorama, they found one more item: a small, water-damaged notebook. Tucked inside, written in neat, precise Portuguese, was a set of cryptic, almost schematic instructions. The note seemed to be a schedule, a list of tasks for a strange and fatal appointment. It read, 16:30 B at the determined place, 18:30 ingest capsules. After the effect, protect metals, await the agreed signal. This note was the Rosetta Stone to a mystery no one could decipher. It was a tantalizing glimpse into the final moments of the 2 men, but every line raised more questions than it answered. What capsules were they supposed to take, and what were they for? What effect were they anticipating? What metals needed protecting, and why? And most importantly, what was the signal they were waiting for? A signal that presumably never came? The police quickly identified the 2 men from documents found in their pockets. They were Manuel Pereira de Cruz, 32, and Miguel José Viana, 34. The initials MAS on the handkerchief likely stood for Miguel, Amigo de Manuel. They were not locals from Niterói or Rio. They were electronics technicians from the town of Campos dos Goitacazes, a city several hours' drive to the north. They were known in their community as respectable, hard-working family men with an interest in electronics and radios. This information only deepened the mystery. Why had these 2 ordinary men traveled so far from their homes, dressed in their Sunday best, to die on a remote, legend-haunted hill, wearing lead masks and clutching a set of bizarre, coded instructions? The initial autopsies, performed in the Niterói medical examiner's office, were inconclusive. Due to the 4-day delay in discovering the bodies and the intense Brazilian heat, the internal organs of both men were too decomposed for a reliable analysis. The medical examiner could find no obvious cause of death. There were no bullet wounds, no stab wounds, no signs of blunt force trauma. A toxicology report was ordered, but the state of the bodies meant that many common poisons, particularly fast-acting organic compounds, would have long since degraded beyond detection. The men, for all scientific intents and purposes, seemed to have simply died. The police were left with a perfect, unsolvable puzzle. 2 bodies, no motive, no murder weapon, and no cause of death. The investigation would have to turn away from the baffling scene on the hill and delve into the lives of the 2 men, hoping to find, in their past, some key that could unlock the secrets of their final, inexplicable journey. With the crime scene on Vintham Hill offering more questions than answers, investigators turned their focus to the lives of Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana. They needed to understand the men to understand the mystery. The picture that emerged was not of 2 random individuals, but of a pair deeply enmeshed in a strange and secretive world that existed on the fringes of science and spirituality. In their hometown of Campos dos Goitacazes, Manuel and Miguel were known as serious, intelligent men, devoted to their families and their work as television and radio repairmen, but they harbored a shared, all-consuming passion. They were self-proclaimed scientific spiritualists. This was not a mainstream belief system. It was a unique, hybrid ideology that blended elements of traditional spiritism, a quasi-religious movement popular in Brazil that focuses on communication with the spirit world, with a fascination for UFOs, extraterrestrial contact, and advanced technology. Manuel and Miguel were part of a small, clandestine group of like-minded individuals who believed they could communicate with beings from other planets and other dimensions. They conducted experiments in their backyard workshops, building strange electronic devices they believed could facilitate this contact. They were, in essence, paranormal investigators, seekers of a truth that lay beyond the veil of conventional reality. The investigation into their final days began to trace a path that was as strange as the scene of their deaths. On the morning of August 17, 1966, 3 days before they were found, Manuel and Miguel told their families they were going on a business trip. They said they needed to travel to Sao Paulo to buy electronic components for their repair shop, as well as a used car. This was a plausible and routine explanation. They took with them a sum of money equivalent to about $2,000 US dollars today. A significant amount, but consistent with their stated goal of purchasing a vehicle and supplies. Their journey, however, did not take them to Sao Paulo. Instead, they boarded a bus headed south to Niterói, the city across the bay from Rio de Janeiro. They arrived in Niterói at 2:30 p.m. From there, the trail of witnesses began to paint a picture of their final, methodical preparations. They went directly to a local electronics shop, where they purchased a waterproof raincoat for each of them, the very raincoats they were found wearing. This was a strange purchase for a sunny August afternoon, suggesting they were anticipating rain, or perhaps some other environmental condition that required protection. Their next stop was a local bar. Here, a waitress named Gracinda Barbosa remembered the two men clearly. She noted their nervous energy. Miguel, she recalled, seemed particularly anxious, constantly checking his watch as if he were on a strict timetable. While at the bar, they bought a bottle of magnesium-rich mineral water, the same brand as the empty bottle found at the scene. Gracinda offered them a glass, but they refused. Miguel paid the bill and kept the receipt, a small, mundane piece of paper that would later become a key piece of evidence. He told the waitress that the water was for later. After leaving the bar, Manuel and Miguel, carrying their raincoats and their bottle of water, began their final ascent up Vintum Hill. They were never seen alive again. The cryptic note found with their bodies: ingest capsules, protect metals, await the agreed signal, now seemed to be the script for this final journey. The police theorized that the capsules were some form of drug, perhaps a hallucinogen like LSD, intended to induce a trance-like state to facilitate contact with otherworldly entities. The instruction to protect metals was more baffling, but in the context of their beliefs, it could have referred to protecting their bodies, the biological metal of their fillings or the electrical impulses of their brains, from some form of energy or radiation they expected to encounter. The lead masks, then, were not for hiding their identities, but were shields, primitive goggles designed to protect their eyes from a blinding light or a powerful energy blast associated with the agreed signal they were waiting for. This theory, that the men died as a result of a spiritual or extraterrestrial contact ritual gone horribly wrong, became the central focus of the investigation. The police began to interview other members of their scientific spiritualist group back in Campos. They uncovered a story of a previous, similar experiment that had taken place a few years earlier. In 1962, a man named Hermes Luis Feitosa, a fellow electronics technician and friend of Manuel and Miguel, had died under mysterious circumstances after participating in a similar ritual. The details were eerily parallel. Hermes had also been attempting to build a device to communicate with aliens and had died after an apparent explosion in his workshop. The official cause of death was ruled an accident, but within their small circle, it was whispered that the experiment had been a success, that Hermes had made contact, and that the resulting energy release had been too powerful for him to handle. This previous incident suggested a pattern. Were Manuel and Miguel trying to replicate or complete Hermes's experiment? Had they learned something from his supposed failure that led them to believe they needed the added protection of the lead masks and the specific preparations outlined in their note? The police also discovered that the two men were not alone in their obsession. They were connected to a shadowy figure, a man who was seen as a leader or guru within their small circle. A friend of the two victims, a man named Elcio Gomez, told police that Manuel and Miguel had recently been inducted into a highly secretive sect of spiritualists. This group believed in a complex cosmology involving benevolent Martians, a coming global catastrophe, and the promise of being rescued by their alien allies. He said that a few days before their trip, Manuel and Miguel had spoken excitedly about a final test they had to undergo, a secret mission that would prove their worthiness to the extraterrestrials. If they passed, they would be granted a great revelation. This guru figure, whose identity was never definitively confirmed, became a prime suspect. Had he provided the two men with the capsules? Were these capsules a lethal poison, disguised as a transcendental drug? This led to the most sinister theory of all, that Manuel and Miguel were not the victims of a failed experiment, but of a deliberate, cold-blooded murder. Perhaps they were on the verge of exposing the group's leader as a fraud, or perhaps their large sum of money, the $2,000 they were carrying, was the true motive. The money was never recovered. Did this supposed spiritual leader lure them to the remote hill with promises of alien contact, only to poison them and steal their money? The waitress from the bar, Gracinda Barbosa, provided a detail that lent some credence to this theory. She remembered that the two men were not alone when they came to the bar. They were accompanied by a third man, a tall, blonde, muscular individual who fit the description of the group's mysterious leader. Had this man followed them up the hill, administered the poison, and then simply walked away, leaving them to die while waiting for a signal that would never come? The case was now a tangled web of possibilities. Were they accidental victims of their own dangerous beliefs, overdosing on a drug they believed would open a doorway to the stars? Or were they the victims of a cunning and ruthless charlatan who had exploited their faith for personal gain? The strange, ritualistic scene on Vintam Hill could be interpreted as either a spiritual ceremony gone wrong or a carefully staged murder designed to look like one. The mystery of the lead masks was no longer just about what had happened on the hill, but about the shadowy world of belief and deception that had led two ordinary men to their extraordinary end. As the investigation continued, the police found themselves navigating a strange and shadowy world where sincere belief and calculated fraud were almost impossible to distinguish. The key to understanding the deaths of Manuel and Miguel lay in unraveling the secrets of the scientific spiritualist community they were a part of. This was not a formal organization with a headquarters and a public-facing doctrine. It was a loose, clandestine network of individuals, communicating through whispers and private meetings, all bound by a shared, unorthodox worldview. The police focused their attention on identifying the other members of this group. Through interviews with the victims' families and friends, they began to piece together a small cast of characters. The central figure remained the unnamed blonde man, the charismatic leader who had supposedly inducted Manuel and Miguel into the group's deepest secrets. But another name also came to the forefront: Elcio Correa Gomez. Elcio was a friend of the two men and a fellow electronics enthusiast who shared their paranormal interests. It was Elcio who had initially told police about the secretive sect and the final test his friends were undertaking. However, as police dug deeper, Elcio's role became more ambiguous. He seemed to know a great deal about the events leading up to the men's deaths, yet his stories were often contradictory. He claimed that the group was attempting to build a device that could communicate with Martians, a project they had become obsessed with after the supposed successful experiment of their friend Hermes Luis Feitosa a few years prior. He described Manuel and Miguel's growing excitement and their belief that they were on the verge of a monumental breakthrough. But his accounts of their final days were vague and shifty. Investigators began to suspect that Elcio was not just a peripheral observer, but was more deeply involved than he was letting on. Was he trying to protect the group's leader, or was he trying to cover his own tracks? The theory that the men had been murdered for their money gained more traction as the investigation stalled. The $2,000 they were carrying was a significant sum, more than enough to serve as a motive for murder. The staged, ritualistic nature of the crime scene could have been a brilliant piece of misdirection. A killer could have lured them to the remote hill with promises of a spiritual rendezvous, persuaded them to ingest a poison disguised as a capsule for their journey, and then arranged the scene with the raincoats, towels, and lead masks to create a bizarre tableau that would confuse investigators and point them towards supernatural explanations. In this scenario, the cryptic note was not a genuine schedule, but a prop, a piece of stagecraft designed to sell the fiction of a paranormal event gone wrong. This murder theory, however, had its own problems. If the motive was simple robbery, why go through such an elaborate and bizarre staging? Why the suits, the raincoats, the carefully positioned bodies? And why use a poison that was so difficult to detect, rather than a more straightforward method of murder? The sheer strangeness of the scene seemed to defy a simple, rational motive like theft. This led investigators back to the more outlandish, but perhaps more likely theory, that the men were the victims of their own beliefs. They were not murdered, but had died by misadventure. In this scenario, the capsules were real, but they were not a lethal poison administered by a third party. They were a powerful hallucinogenic or psychotropic drug that the men took willingly. Believing they were about to make contact with extraterrestrial beings, they followed the instructions in their notebook precisely. They ingested the capsules at 6:30 p.m., put on their lead masks to protect themselves from the anticipated blinding light of a UFO, and lay down to await the signal. The cause of death in this scenario could have been a fatal overdose. Perhaps the drug was more potent than they realized, or they had an unforeseen adverse reaction, or, in their profoundly altered state of consciousness, they may have simply succumbed to the elements. Lying on the cold, damp ground for hours on a remote hill, even with raincoats, could have led to hypothermia, which could have been fatal when combined with the physiological effects of a powerful drug. The empty water bottle and wet towels might have been part of their ritual, perhaps to cool themselves down during the drug's initial, intense effects. This theory was supported by the testimony of several witnesses who lived near Vinton Hill. On the night of August 17th, the night Manol and Miguel are believed to have died, several residents reported seeing a strange, brightly glowing, orange-colored object hovering over the peak of the hill. The object was described as egg-shaped and was said to have emitted powerful beams of light down towards the ground. It reportedly remained there for several minutes before ascending rapidly and silently into the night sky. These UFO sightings were, of course, impossible to verify. Were they genuine, unexplained phenomena? Or were they simply the product of local folklore and overactive imaginations? Stories that were embellished and attached to the case after the fact. For the investigators, these reports were a dead end. They could not base a homicide investigation on anecdotal accounts of flying saucers. But for those who believed in the paranormal, these sightings were the key to the entire mystery. They were the signal that Manol and Miguel had been waiting for. In this version of the story, the two men had succeeded. They had made contact. But the experience, as their friend Hermes had supposedly discovered years earlier, had been too powerful for their mortal bodies to withstand. They had died not from poison or exposure, but from a direct encounter with the unknown. The case was now split into two irreconcilable narratives. The first was a rational, criminal explanation, murder for profit, cleverly disguised as a paranormal event. The second was a paranormal explanation, a spiritual quest that ended in accidental death, or even a successful but fatal rendezvous with an otherworldly intelligence. The police, bound by the rules of evidence and logic, leaned towards the former. They continued to investigate the human suspects, the blonde guru, and the shifty friend, Elcio Gomez, but they could never find enough evidence to make an arrest. The leader of the group was never definitively identified, and Elcio's inconsistencies were not enough to charge him with a crime. The lack of a clear cause of death remained the single biggest obstacle. Without knowing how the men died, it was impossible to prove that a crime had even been committed. The inconclusive toxicology reports left a void at the heart of the case that could never be filled. As the weeks turned into months, and the months into years, the investigation grew cold. The strange, ritualistic scene on the hill, the cryptic note, and the lead masks themselves became the only witnesses to what had happened, and they were silent. The case was officially closed, but the mystery was far from over. It would pass from the hands of the police into the realm of legend, becoming one of the most enduring and debated paranormal cases of the 20th century. A story that perfectly blurred the line between true crime and the unexplained. With the official police investigation at a dead end, The lead masks case began a second life as a cornerstone of paranormal and UFO-related folklore. It contained all the perfect ingredients for a modern myth. Two ordinary men on a secret mission, a cryptic set of instructions, bizarre ritualistic objects, and credible witness testimony of a UFO sighting at the exact time and place of their deaths. For decades, the story was kept alive not by law enforcement, but by paranormal investigators, ufologists, and writers who saw the case as one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for extraterrestrial contact ever recorded. These researchers proposed theories that were far beyond the scope of the police investigation. They speculated that the capsules were not drugs, but some form of advanced technology, perhaps a teleportation device or a consciousness-transferring mechanism given to them by their alien contacts. The lead masks, in this view, were essential protective gear, shielding the men's optic nerves from the intense psychic or radiative energy of the event. The deaths, they argued, were not accidental but a known risk, a possible side effect of interdimensional travel. Some even suggested that the men hadn't truly died at all, but that their physical bodies were simply the discarded shells left behind after their consciousnesses had successfully been transported aboard the alien craft. The neatly arranged scene was not a staged murder, but the respectful aftermath of a successful, albeit fatal, ascension. A French ufologist named Jacques Vallée, known for his more skeptical and scientific approach to the phenomenon, took a particular interest in the case. He saw it as a prime example of what he called a control system, a theory that suggests UFO phenomena are not necessarily extraterrestrial in origin, but are a form of psychological manipulation by an unknown, possibly terrestrial intelligence. In his view, the lead masks case was a perfect illustration of how this phenomenon can mimic religious or spiritual encounters, leading sincere believers to perform ritualistic acts that can have fatal consequences. The story for Vallée was not about aliens, but about the dangerous power of belief and the human susceptibility to manipulation by forces we do not understand. As the years passed, the physical evidence from the case was lost or degraded, and the witnesses aged and died, making a renewed official investigation nearly impossible. The mystery seemed destined to remain unsolved forever, a perfect, hermetically sealed enigma. However, in the 21st century, a strange and unexpected postscript to the story emerged. A relative of Miguel José Viana, his cousin's son, revealed a piece of family lore that had never been shared with the police. He claimed that for years after the men's deaths, the family had been tormented by a strange phenomenon. A glowing, spherical UFO would frequently appear over their home, hovering silently, as if it were watching them or waiting for something. The family, terrified and believing the object was connected to the deaths of Manuel and Miguel, lived in a state of quiet fear for years. This revelation, while purely anecdotal, added another layer of high strangeness to the already baffling case. The legacy of the lead masks case is one of enduring, profound mystery. It is a story that stubbornly refuses to be solved, a puzzle where every piece fits into multiple, mutually exclusive pictures. Was it a simple, sordid murder for money, brilliantly disguised by a killer who understood his victim's bizarre beliefs? Or was it a tragic accident, the result of two sincere but misguided men taking a fatal gamble in their quest for cosmic truth? Or, as a dedicated subculture continues to believe, was it something else entirely? A genuine, documented encounter with the unknown that proves we are not alone in the universe? Each theory leaves unanswered questions. If it was murder, the killer's cunning and foresight were almost preternatural. If it was an accidental overdose, the coincidence of the UFO sighting on the same night is almost too incredible to dismiss. And if it was a genuine paranormal event, it represents a truth so profound it would change our understanding of reality itself. The lead masks themselves have become iconic artifacts of the unexplained. They sit at the center of the story, two crude pieces of metal that symbolize the entire enigma. Were they the foolish props in a con man's deadly game? Or were they the essential tools for a journey to the stars? They are a perfect physical metaphor for the case itself. They were designed to be looked through, to witness something extraordinary, yet they are opaque, offering no vision at all. The lead masks case remains a chilling and fascinating chapter in the annals of true crime and the paranormal. It is a story that forces us to confront the limits of our own understanding, to walk the fine line between rational investigation and the possibility of a world far stranger than we can imagine. The two men who died on Vintam Hill, Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel Jose Viana, embarked on a journey to find a signal from another world. They never returned, but they left behind a signal of their own. A haunting, unanswered question that continues to echo from a lonely, windswept hill in Brazil. The enigma of Vintam Hill is a mystery born from a specific, strange event. But some mysteries are not singular. They are a pattern, a series of disappearances over many years, all connected by the cold, unforgiving waters of a single vast lake. The Bennington Triangle in the southwestern corner of Vermont, nestled in the Green Mountains, lies a vast, sprawling wilderness that is both breathtakingly beautiful and deeply unsettling. It is a land of dense, primeval forests, granite-topped peaks, and abandoned logging towns that are slowly being reclaimed by nature. At its heart stands Glastonbury Mountain, a place the local Native American tribes, the Algonquians, were said to have avoided for centuries. They considered it cursed ground, a place where the four winds met in eternal conflict, a place where men would go and never return. They spoke of a swallowing stone that would consume anyone who stepped on it. For most of modern history, these were just stories, the folkloric whispers of a bygone era. But in the middle of the 20th century, over a 5-year period, a series of bizarre and inexplicable disappearances would occur in this very area, transforming the old legends into a terrifying, modern reality and earning the region a new, chilling name: the Bennington Triangle. The term itself was coined by a New England author and paranormal researcher named Joseph A. Citro in the 1990s, but the mystery he named had its roots decades earlier. The triangle is loosely defined as the area surrounding Glastonbury Mountain and its neighboring peaks. It is a place of profound, disorienting wildness. The terrain is rugged and unforgiving, marked by sudden, violent shifts in weather. Thick fogs can roll in without warning. Visibility can drop to zero in an instant, and compasses are known to spin erratically due to natural magnetic anomalies in the rock. It is a place where it is easy to get lost. But the disappearances that define the Bennington Triangle are not simple cases of hikers succumbing to the elements. They are stories of people who vanished completely, under baffling circumstances, often in the presence of others, leaving behind no trace, no clues, and no answers. The first of the core disappearances that would define the mystery occurred on November 12, 1945. The man who vanished was Midday Rivers, a 74-year-old outdoorsman who had spent his entire life in the shadow of Glastonbury Mountain. He was not a novice hiker or a lost tourist. He was an expert hunter and fishing guide who knew the woods, its trails, and its dangers better than anyone. On that cold autumn day, Rivers was leading a group of 4 hunters up the mountain. He was a familiar, reassuring presence, the seasoned veteran guiding the less experienced men through his territory. As the group made their way along the long trail, a well-known hiking path that snakes through the region, Rivers walked slightly ahead of the others. As they rounded a bend in the trail, the 4 hunters behind him lost sight of him for just a few moments. It was a completely normal, unremarkable occurrence. When they reached the spot where they had last seen him, he was gone. They called his name, expecting him to emerge from the trees, perhaps having stepped off the trail for a moment. But the only answer was the sound of the wind sighing through the pines. At first, they weren't overly concerned. Midday was an expert. They assumed he had spotted something and had quietly moved ahead, or that they had somehow missed a turn. They continued on to their planned campsite, fully expecting to find him there, waiting for them by a fire. But the campsite was empty. A profound sense of unease began to settle over the group. They fired their rifles into the air, the traditional signal for a lost hunter, but there was no response. As dusk began to fall, their unease turned to genuine fear. They made their way back down the mountain and alerted the authorities. The search for Midday Rivers began immediately and was one of the largest in the state's history. Over 300 volunteers, including local residents, state police, and even soldiers from the National Guard, combed the area for weeks. They scoured every trail, every ravine, every hollow. The terrain was difficult, but the search was thorough and methodical. They were searching for a man who had vanished from a clearly marked trail, in a moment's time, in front of 4 witnesses. Yet they found nothing, not a single footprint off the path, not a scrap of torn clothing, not a single drop of blood. The only clue they found was a single solitary rifle cartridge in a stream bed. It was a cartridge that Midday was known to have carried, but it offered no explanation for his disappearance. It was as if he had simply been plucked from the earth. Theories abounded. Had he suffered a sudden heart attack or stroke and stumbled off the trail into a deep crevice? It was possible, but seemed unlikely for a man of his experience not to leave some kind of sign. And the search parties had been meticulous. Had he been attacked by a wild animal like a bear? Again possible, but a struggle would have left behind evidence. Blood, torn clothing, drag marks. There was none. The local community was baffled and spooked. Midday Rivers was not the kind of man to simply get lost. He was a part of the mountain itself. His disappearance felt unnatural, a violation of the known order of things. After weeks of fruitless searching, the official effort was called off. Midday Rivers was gone, the first victim of a mystery that was only just beginning to unfold. The old stories of the swallowing stone no longer felt like mere folklore. For the people of Bennington, they now had a face and a name. The disappearance of Midday Rivers in the autumn of 1945 left a scar on the local community. It was a baffling, unsettling event that defied easy explanation. But in the grand scheme of things, it could still be rationalized. An elderly man, even an experienced one, could have a medical emergency, could fall, could become disoriented. The wilderness is unforgiving. For a year, the mystery of his vanishing remained a local tragedy, a strange story told around campfires. But what happened next, just over a year later, would transform the story from a singular, sad event into the beginning of a terrifying and inexplicable pattern. The mountain, it seemed, was not finished. The second disappearance, and the one that would truly cement the region's dark reputation, centered on a young woman named Paula Jean Weldon. In December of 1946, Paula was an 18-year-old sophomore at Bennington College, a progressive and prestigious liberal arts school, known for its independent and artistic student body. Paula fit the mold perfectly. She was bright, creative, and possessed a restless, searching spirit. By all accounts, she was a typical college student, navigating the pressures of coursework and the complexities of young adulthood. She was reportedly feeling a bit melancholic and dissatisfied with college life, a feeling not uncommon among students, but one that would be intensely scrutinized in the aftermath of her disappearance. On Sunday, December 1st, 1946, Paula finished her shift working in the college dining hall. It was a chilly but clear winter afternoon. She returned to her dormitory room and told her roommate, Elizabeth Johnson, that she was feeling the need to clear her head. "I'm off to take a long walk," she said. She changed into walking clothes, a distinctive, bright red parka, blue jeans, and sneakers. It was casual attire, suitable for a stroll, but conspicuously inadequate for a serious, long-distance hike in the cold Vermont mountains, especially as dusk approached. She left behind all her identification and what little money she had. She seemed to have no specific destination in mind other than the woods themselves. Her journey from the college campus to the wilderness can be traced with a frustrating degree of clarity. She walked from the college to the main road, where she hitched a ride with a local man who was driving a pickup truck. She was cheerful and chatty, telling the driver she was headed for a hike on the long trail. This was the very same trail from which Midday Rivers had vanished a year earlier. The driver dropped her off near the trailhead in the late afternoon, around 2:45 p.m. From there, Paula began her walk. She was not alone on the trail that day. Her distinctive red coat made her an easily memorable figure. She was seen by several people. An older couple, the McDowells, were hiking down the trail as she was hiking up. They recalled exchanging a few pleasantries with the young, red-coated woman. She asked them how far the trail went, and they chatted for a moment before continuing on their separate ways. A little further up the trail, she was seen by another hiker, a man from Bennington named Ernest Whitman. He later told police that he saw her round a rocky outcropping on the trail about 100 yards ahead of him, and then she was gone. The sequence of events was almost an exact, terrifying echo of Midday Rivers's disappearance. A person walking on a well-defined path, seen by multiple witnesses, simply vanishes in the brief interval between one sighting and the next. When Ernest Whitman reached the rocky outcropping where he had last seen Paula, there was no sign of her. The trail ahead was empty. There were no side paths, no forks in the road where she could have turned off. On one side of the trail was a steep, rocky embankment. On the other, a gentle, wooded slope. There was nowhere for her to have gone in such a short amount of time without being seen or heard. Yet, she had vanished as completely as if the ground had opened up and swallowed her. Back at Bennington College, her roommate grew concerned when Paula didn't return that evening. By the next morning, Elizabeth Johnson knew something was wrong and reported Paula missing to the college administration. Here, a critical and frustrating delay occurred. The college president, hoping to avoid a scandal and believing Paula might have simply run off for a few days, waited until late in the day on Monday to notify her parents and the police. Precious time was lost. When the search finally began, it was a massive undertaking. The disappearance of a young, female college student sparked a level of media attention and official response that had dwarfed the search for Midday Rivers. Paula's father, a prominent industrial designer from Connecticut, arrived and offered a substantial reward. The FBI was called in. Hundreds of searchers, including state police from Vermont, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, along with scores of Bennington College students and faculty, fanned out across the mountain. They searched for weeks, battling dropping temperatures and fresh snowfall that blanketed the area, obscuring any potential tracks. The investigation explored every conceivable rational theory. The most prominent was that Paula had met with foul play. Police intensely investigated Ernest Whitman, the last man to see her, as well as a local lumberjack who lived in a shack near the trail and had a reputation for strange behavior. Both men were eventually cleared. Another theory was that she had simply run away to start a new life, perhaps with a secret lover in Canada. Her unhappiness at college seemed to support this idea, but it made little sense. Why would she stage such a bizarre and public disappearance, leaving all her money and belongings behind, when she could have simply boarded a bus? The third theory was that she had succumbed to the elements. Perhaps she had strayed from the trail, fallen, and become injured or disoriented as darkness fell. The inadequate clothing she was wearing would have made her highly susceptible to hypothermia. But this theory ran into the same insurmountable wall as it had in the Midday Rivers case: the complete and total lack of any physical evidence. In one of the largest and most thorough searches in Vermont history, not a single trace of Paula Jean Weldon was ever found. No body, no scrap of her distinctive red parka, no footprint, nothing. The case had a lasting and significant impact on law enforcement in the state. The chaotic and often uncoordinated nature of the search, which involved multiple local and state agencies with overlapping jurisdictions, highlighted a major flaw in Vermont's public safety infrastructure. At the time, Vermont was one of the only states in the Union without a statewide police force. The high-profile failure to find any trace of Paula Weldon was the direct catalyst for the creation of the Vermont State Police in July of 1947. But for the people of Bennington and the surrounding area, the legacy was something far less tangible and far more frightening. Two people had now disappeared from the same mountain on the same trail in almost the exact same manner, just over a year apart. One was an elderly man who knew the woods like the back of his hand. The other was a young woman who barely knew them at all. The rational explanations, getting lost, foul play, running away, all seemed to crumble under the weight of the sheer impossibility of it all. The old legends of Glastonbury Mountain no longer felt like quaint folklore. A palpable sense of fear began to grip the region. The Bennington Triangle was beginning to earn its name, and the pattern of strange disappearances was not yet complete. For 3 years, an uneasy quiet settled over Glastonbury Mountain. The disappearances of Midday Rivers and Paula Weldon became chilling local legends, cautionary tales told to warn hikers and hunters of the mountain's unpredictable nature. The community lived with a low-grade, persistent fear, a sense of a malevolent presence in the woods that defied rational explanation. The creation of the Vermont State Police was a tangible result of the tragedies, a sign that the authorities were taking the dangers of the region seriously, but no amount of organized law enforcement could prepare them for the events that would unfold next. A series of disappearances so rapid and so bizarre that they would stretch the bounds of belief and solidify the Bennington Triangle's place in the annals of the unexplained. The third disappearance occurred on December 1st, 1949, exactly 3 years to the day after Paula Weldon had vanished. The man who disappeared was James E. Tedford, a 68-year-old veteran who was a resident of the Bennington Soldiers' Home. Tedford's case is perhaps the strangest of all, as it did not begin in the woods of Glastonbury Mountain, but on a moving bus. On that day, Tedford had been in St. Albans, Vermont, visiting relatives. In the afternoon, he boarded a local bus to make the long journey back to Bennington. He was a familiar figure to the other passengers and the driver. He had made the trip many times before. He was seen by multiple witnesses getting on the bus, carrying his luggage and settling in for the ride. 14 other passengers saw him on the bus during the journey, sleeping in his seat. The bus made several stops along its route, but no one saw Tedford get off. As the bus pulled into its final destination in Bennington, James Tedford was no longer on it. He was gone. His luggage was still on the overhead rack. A bus timetable lay open on his empty seat, but the man himself had vanished. The other passengers and the driver were utterly baffled. The bus had been in constant motion, and Tedford had been sleeping in his seat just one stop before the final destination. There was no conceivable way for him to have exited the vehicle without anyone noticing. It was as if he had simply dematerialized from his seat. A police investigation was launched, but it was an inquiry with nowhere to go. How do you search for a man who disappears from a moving bus? They checked every stop along the route. No one recalled seeing a man matching Tedford's description getting off. The other 14 passengers were interviewed extensively. They all confirmed he had been on the bus, and they were all unanimous in their certainty that he had not disembarked. The case was a perfect, hermetically sealed impossibility. The connection to the Bennington Triangle might have seemed tenuous at first, a strange coincidence of geography. But when investigators delved into James Tedford's past, they uncovered a detail that sent a chill through the community. Tedford's wife had disappeared under mysterious circumstances several years earlier. And where had she been living at the time? In a small house on the edge of the very same Glastonbury wilderness where Midday Rivers and Paula Weldon had vanished. The coincidence was too great to ignore. Had Tedford, for some unknown reason, decided to follow his wife into the same enigmatic void? Or was his disappearance from the bus, as it traveled through the heart of the Bennington Triangle, part of the same incomprehensible phenomenon that had claimed the others? Less than a year later, the Triangle would claim its youngest victim. On October 28, 1950, an 8-year-old boy named Paul Jepson disappeared. Paul had accompanied his mother on a trip into the mountains. She worked as a caretaker for a local hog farm, and she drove a truck up a remote road to feed the animals, with Paul sitting beside her. It was a routine chore she had performed many times. When they arrived at the farm, she left Paul in the truck while she went to tend to the pigs. She was gone for no more than an hour. The area was a small, open clearing. Paul was in plain sight of the road and the pigsty. When his mother returned to the truck, it was empty. Paul was gone. A frantic search of the immediate area began. His mother, her cries echoing through the silent woods, could find no trace of him. The authorities were called immediately, and a massive search party was organized. Bloodhounds were brought in to track the boy's scent. The dogs were able to pick up Paul's trail and followed it from the truck up a local road for a short distance. Then, at a particular intersection in the road, the trail went cold. The dogs became confused, circling the spot over and over, unable to pick up the scent in any direction. It was the exact spot where, for years earlier, Paula Weldon had last been seen. The implication was terrifying. It was as if Paul had simply been lifted from the road at that very spot, his scent trail ending abruptly in midair. The search continued for weeks, but just like in the previous cases, it yielded absolutely nothing. Not a footprint, not a piece of clothing, Not a single clue to explain how an 8-year-old boy could vanish from an open clearing in broad daylight, while his mother was just a few hundred feet away. The community was now in the grip of genuine panic. For people had disappeared in the space of 5 years, all within the same small, haunted geography. The victims had nothing in common. An elderly expert, a young college student, a middle-aged veteran, and a small child. The circumstances of their disappearances were equally varied, from a busy hiking trail to a moving bus to a farm clearing. The only common denominator was the place itself. The old legends no longer felt like stories. They felt like a warning that had gone unheeded. The media began to pick up on the string of disappearances, and the story of the Bennington Triangle began to take shape in the national consciousness. But the strange, 5-year cycle of terror was not quite over. There was one more victim to be claimed, and her case would be both the most straightforward and, in some ways, the most unsettling of them all. The disappearance of young Paul Jepson in October of 1950 marked the terrifying climax of the Bennington Triangle's 5-year cycle of mystery. The community was on edge, gripped by a fear that was all the more potent for being so completely inexplicable. The local press and authorities were at a total loss. There were no suspects, no rational patterns, and no evidence to suggest a human predator was at work. The theories that circulated were wild and desperate, ranging from a serial killer with an almost supernatural ability to leave no trace, to the more folkloric explanations of a man-eating stone, or a portal to another dimension. The only certainty was that Glastonbury Mountain and its surroundings had become a place of profound dread. Just 16 days after Paul Jepson vanished, the Triangle claimed its 5th and final victim in this strange cluster of disappearances. On November 11, 1950, a 53-year-old woman named Frida Langer set out on a hiking trip with her cousin Herbert Elsner. Frida was an experienced hiker and woodswoman, familiar with the terrain. She and her cousin were hiking on the Somerset Reservoir Trail, on the eastern side of the Glastonbury Wilderness. The day was overcast and chilly. At one point during their hike, Frida slipped and fell into a small stream. Her clothes were soaked and she was cold. She told her cousin that she was going to turn back and return to their campsite to change into dry clothes while he continued the hike. She was a capable and independent woman, and the campsite was less than half a mile away on a clearly marked trail. Herbert watched her turn and begin to walk back down the path. It was the last time he would see her alive. When Herbert returned to the campsite a few hours later, Frida was not there. The fire was out, and there was no sign that she had ever made it back. Alarmed, he immediately began to search for her, calling her name. When darkness fell and there was still no sign of her, he made his way out of the woods and alerted the authorities. The search for Frida Langer was the most intensive one yet. The recent, high-profile disappearance of Paul Jepson meant that law enforcement and the local community were on high alert. Over the next 2 weeks, more than 400 searchers, including state police, the National Guard, firefighters, and local volunteers, conducted a massive, grid-by-grid search of the area. Helicopters and light aircraft were brought in to scour the landscape from the air. But just as in all the previous cases, the search turned up absolutely nothing. It was as if Frida Langer, like the others, had simply been erased from existence. The case remained cold for nearly 7 months. Then, on May 12, 1951, 2 fishermen were hiking through a remote, high-elevation area near the Somerset Reservoir, an area that had been repeatedly and thoroughly searched the previous fall. There, in a clearing, they found a decomposing human body. It was the remains of Frida Langer. The discovery of her body was both a relief and a source of even deeper mystery. It was the only time a victim of the Bennington Triangle disappearances had ever been found. But the circumstances of the discovery were deeply bizarre. The location where she was found was in open, easily visible terrain that had been scoured by hundreds of searchers. It seemed impossible that her body could have been there for 7 months without being seen. This led to the chilling theory that her body had not been there the whole time, but had been moved or returned to the spot long after the search had ended. Furthermore, the state of her body was inexplicable. Despite having been exposed to the harsh Vermont winter for 7 months, the body was not nearly as decomposed as investigators would have expected. An autopsy was performed, But due to the state of the remains, no definitive cause of death could be determined. There were no signs of violence or foul play. It appeared as though she had simply lain down and died. But why would an experienced hiker, cold and wet but otherwise unharmed, lie down and die in an open field less than a mile from her campsite? And how could her body have remained undiscovered for so long in such a heavily searched area? The discovery of Frida Langer, which should have provided a resolution to at least one of the cases, only added a new layer of high strangeness to the enigma. After the discovery of Frida's body, the strange cycle of disappearances in the Bennington Triangle abruptly stopped. There have been no other officially linked, unexplained disappearances in the area since 1950. The 5-year period between 1945 and 1950 remains a bizarre and isolated cluster of high strangeness. The legacy of the Bennington Triangle is a tapestry woven from folklore, tragedy, and enduring mystery. Rational explanations have been offered for each individual case. Midday Rivers could have had a heart attack. Paula Weldon could have run away or met with foul play. James Tedford could have had a psychological break and slipped away unnoticed. Paul Jepson could have gotten lost and succumbed to the elements. Frida Langer could have died of exposure. But when viewed as a collective whole, the sheer improbability of so many disparate people vanishing without a trace under such bizarre circumstances, in such a small geographic area and a short time frame, strains the limits of coincidence and rational explanation. The more esoteric theories continue to thrive. Some point to the old Native American legends of the swallowing stone or suggest a cryptid like a Bigfoot was responsible. Others, pointing to the erratic compass readings and strange lights, suggest the area is a window or portal to another dimension, a place where the fabric of reality is thin. And, of course, the specter of alien abduction hangs over the entire mystery, particularly in the cases of Paul Jepson and James Tedford, whose disappearances seem to defy the laws of physics. Today, the Bennington Triangle remains a place of quiet dread and fascination. It is a story that has no ending, a puzzle with too many missing pieces. The 5 people who vanished between 1945 and 1950 are forever linked, their individual tragedies woven into a single, chilling narrative. They are a permanent reminder that there are still places in our modern world, on the edges of our maps and our understanding, where the woods are deep and dark, and where people can still, for reasons we may never comprehend, simply walk away and never be seen again. The enigma of the Bennington Triangle is a mystery of place, where the land itself seems to be the antagonist. But sometimes, the most terrifying mysteries are not tied to a location, but to an object, an ordinary, everyday product that can be turned into an instrument of mass terror, leaving a legacy of fear that changes a nation forever.